Chapter 17 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 17. The other day, while looking through a limbo of a drawer wherein had been cast from time to time a medley of maimed, half-soiled, abortive things, too unfitted for the paradise of publication, and too good, so my vanity will have it, for the damnation of the waste paper basket, I came across, at the very bottom, the manuscript of the preceding autobiographical narrative, the last words of which I wrote of Mustapha Superior 3 years ago. At first I carried it about with me, not caring to destroy it, and not knowing what in the world to do with it, until, with the malice of inanimate things, the dirty dog's-eared bundle took to haunting me, turning up continually in inconvenient places, and ever insistently demanding a new depository. At last I began to look on it with loathing, and one day, in a fit of inspiration, creating the limbo aforesaid, I hurled the manuscript, as I thought, into everlasting oblivion. I had no desire to carry on the record of my life any further, and there, in limbo, it has remained for 3 years. But the other day I took it out for reference, and now, as I am holiday-making in a certain little backwater of the world, where it is raining in a most unholiday fashion, it occurs to me that, as everything has happened to me which is likely to happen, heaven knows I want no more excursions and alarms in my life's drama, I may as well bring the narrative up to date. I therefore take up the thread, so far as I can, from where I left off. Lola, having nothing to do in Algiers, which had grown hateful to us both, accompanied me to London. As, however, the weather was rough, and she was a very bad sailor, I saw little of her on the voyage. For my own part, I enjoyed the stormy days, the howling winds, and the infuriated waves dashing impotently over the steamer. They filled me with a sense of conflict and of amusement. It is always good to see man triumphing over the murderous forces of nature. It puts one in conceit with one's own kind. At Waterloo I handed Lola over to her maid, who had come to meet her, and, leaving Rogers in charge of my luggage, I drove homeward in a cab. It was only as I was crossing Waterloo Bridge and saw the dark mass of the Houses of Parliament looming on the other side of the river, and the light in the tower which showed that the House was sitting, that I began to realise my situation. As exiles in desert lands yearn for green fields, so yearned I for those green benches. In vain I represented to myself how often I had yawned on them, how often I had cursed my folly in sitting on them and listening to empty babble when I might have been dining cosily, or talking to a pretty woman, or listening to a comic opera, or performing some other useful and self-satisfying action of the kind. In vain I told myself what a monument of futility was that building. I longed to be in it, and of it once again. And when I realised that I yearned for the impossible, my heart was like a stone. For indeed, I, Simon de Gex, with London once a toy in my hand, was coming into it now, a penniless adventurer, to seek my fortune. The cab turned into the Strand, which greeted me as affably as a pandemonium. Motor omnibuses whizzed at me, cabs rattled and jeered at me. Private motors and carriages passed me by in sleek contempt. Policemen regarded me scornfully, as, with uplifted hand regulating the traffic, they held me up. Pavements full of people surged along, ostentatiously showing that they did not care a brass farthing for me. The thousands of lights with their million reflections from shop fronts, restaurants, theatres, and illuminated signs glared pitilessly at me. A harsh roar of derision filled the air like the bass to the treble of the newsboys who yelled in my face. I was wearing a fur-lined coat, just the thing a penniless adventurer would wear. I had a valet attending to my luggage, just the sort of thing a penniless adventurer would have. I was driving to the Albany, just the sort of place where a penniless adventurer would live. And London knew all this, and scoffed at me in stony heartlessness. The only object that gave me the slightest sympathy was Nelson on the top of his column. He seemed to say, After all, you can't feel such a fool and so much out of it in the cold as I do up here. At Piccadilly Circus I found the same atmosphere of hostility. My cab was blocked in the theatre-going tide, and in neighbouring vehicles I had glimpses of fair faces above soft wraps and the profiles of moustached young men in white ties. They assumed an aggravating air of ownership of the blazing thoroughfare, the only gay and joyous spot in London. I too had owned it once, but now I felt an alien, and the whole spirit of Piccadilly Circus rammed the sentiment home. I was an alien, and an undesirable alien. I felt even more lost and friendless as I entered the long, cold arcade known as the Rope Walk of the Albany. I found my sister Agatha waiting for me in the library. I had telegraphed to her from Southampton. She was expensively dressed in grey silk and wore the family diamonds. We exchanged the family kiss and the usual incoherent greetings of our race. She expressed her delight at my restoration to health, and gave me satisfactory tidings of Tom Durrell, her husband, of the children, and of our sister Jane. Then she shook her head at me and made me feel like a naughty little boy. This I resented. Being the head of the family, I had always encouraged the deferential attitude which my sisters, dear right-minded things, had naturally assumed from babyhood. "Oh, Simon, what a time you've given us!" She had never spoken to me like this in her life. "That's nothing, my dear Agatha," said I, just a bit tartly, "to the time I've given myself. I'm sorry for you, but I think you ought to be a little sorry for me." "I am, more sorry than I can say. Oh, Simon, how could you?" "How could I what?" I cried, unwontedly regardless of the refinements of language. "Mix yourself up in this dreadful affair." "My dear girl," said I, "if you got mixed up in a railway collision, I shouldn't ask you how you managed to do it. I should be sorry for you and feel your arms and legs and inquire whether you had sustained any internal injuries." She is a pretty, spare woman with a bird-like face and soft brown hair, just turning grey, and as good-hearted a little creature as ever adored 5 healthy children and an elderly baronet with disastrous views on scientific farming. "Dear old boy," she said in milder accents, "I didn't mean to be unkind. I wanted to be good to you and help you, so much so that I asked Bingley is my housekeeper, whether I could stay to dinner." "That's good of you, but this magnificence?" "I'm going on later to the Foreign Office reception." "Then you do still mingle with the great and gorgeous?" I said. "What do you mean? Why shouldn't I?" I laughed, suspecting rightly that my sister's social position had not been greatly imperilled by the profligacy of their scandal-bespattered brother. "What are people saying about me?" I asked suddenly. She made a helpless gesture. "Can't you guess? You've told us the facts, and of course we believe you. We've done our best to spread abroad the correct version. But you know what people are. If they're told they oughtn't to believe the worst, they're disappointed and still go on believing it so as to comfort themselves." "You cynical little wretch," said I. "But it's true," she urged. "And after all, even if they were well-disposed, the correct version makes considerable demands on their faith. Even Letty Fairfax—" I know," said I. "Letty Fairfax is typical. She would love to be on the side of the angels, but as she wouldn't meet the best people there, she arranges herself with the other party." Presently we dined, and during the meal, when the servants happened to be out of the room, we continued, snippet-wise, the inconclusive conversation. Like a good sister, Agatha had come to cheer a lonely and much-abused man. Like a daughter of Eve, she had also come to find out as much as she possibly could. "I think I must tell you something which you ought to know," she said. "It's all over the town that you stole the lady from Dale Kinnersley." "If I did," said I, "it was at his mother's earnest entreaty. You can tell folks that. You can also tell them Madame Brandt is not the kind of woman to be stolen by one man from another. She is a thoroughly virtuous, good and noble woman, and there's not a creature living who wouldn't be honoured by her friendship." As I made this announcement with an impetuosity which reminded me, with a twinge of remorse, of poor Dale's dithyrambics, Agatha shot at me a quick glance of apprehension. "But, my dear Simon, she used to act in a circus with a horse." "I fail to see," said I, growing angry, "how the horse could have imbued her with depravity, and I'm given to understand that the tone of the circus is not quite what it used to be in the days of the Empress Theodora." A ripple passed over Agatha's bare shoulders, which I knew to be a suppressed shrug. "I suppose men and women look at these things differently," she remarked, and from the stiffness of her tone I divined that the idea of moral qualities lurking in the nature of Lola Brandt occasioned her considerable displeasure. "I hope—" She paused. There was another ripple. "No, I had better not say it. It's none of my business after all." "I don't think it is, my dear," said I. Rogers, bringing in the cutlets, ended the snippet of talk. It was not the cheeriest of dinners. I took advantage of the next interval of quiet to inquire after Dale. I learned that the poor boy had almost collapsed after the election, and was now yachting with young Lord Essendale somewhere about the Hebrides. Agatha had not seen him, but Lady Kinnersley had called on her one day in a distracted frame of mind, bitterly reproaching me for the unhappiness of her son. I should never have suspected that such fierce maternal love could burn beneath Lady Kinnersley's granite exterior. She accused me of treachery towards Dale, and most illogically of dishonourable conduct towards herself. "She said things about you," said Agatha, "for which, even if they were true, I couldn't forgive her. So that's an end of that friendship. Indeed, it has been very difficult, Simon," she continued, "to keep up with our common friends. It is in the most painful and delicate situation. And now you're back, I'm afraid it will be worse." Thus, under all Agatha's affection, there ran the general hostility of London. Guilty or not, I had offended her in her most deeply rooted susceptibilities, and as yet she only knew half the imbroglio in which I was enmeshed. Over coffee, however, she began to take a more optimistic view of affairs. "After all, you'll be able to live it down," she said, with a cheerful air of patronage. "People soon forget. Before the year is out, you'll be going about just as usual, and at the general election you'll find a seat somewhere." I informed her that I had given up politics. "What, then," she asked, "would I do for an occupation?" "Work for my living," I replied. "Work?" She arched her eyebrows as if it were the most extraordinary thing a man could do. "What kind of work?" "Road sweeping, or tax collecting, or envelope addressing." She selected a cigarette from the silver box in front of her, and did not reply until she had lit it and inhaled a puff or two. "I wish you wouldn't be so flippant, Simon." From this remark I inferred that I still was in the criminal dock before this Lady Chief Justice. I smiled at the airs the little woman gave herself, now that I was no longer the impeccable and irreproachable dictator of the family. Mine was the experience of every fallen tyrant since the world began. "My dear Agatha, I've had enough shocks during the last few weeks to knock the flippancy out of a congregational minister. In November I was condemned to die within 6 months. The sentence was final and absolute. I thought I would do the kind of good one can't do with a lifetime in front of one, and I wasted substances in riotous giving. In the elegant phraseology of high society, I am stone broke. As my training has not fitted me to earn my living in highfalutin ways, I must earn it in some humble capacity. Therefore, if you see me call at your house for the water rate, you'll understand that I am driven to that expedient by necessity and not by degradation." Naturally, I had to elaborate this succinct statement before my sister could understand its full significance. Then dismay overwhelmed her. Surely something could be done. The fortunes of Jane and herself were at my disposal to set me on my feet again. We were brother and sisters. What was theirs was mine. They couldn't see me starve. I thanked her for her affection. The dear creatures would unhesitatingly have let me play ducks and drakes with their money. But I explained that, though poor, I was still proud, and prized the independence of the tax collector above the position of the pensioner of love's bounty. "Tom must get you something to do," she declared. "Tom must do nothing of the kind. Let me say that, once and for all," I returned peremptorily. I've made my position clear to you because you're my sister, and you ought to be spared any further misinterpretation of my actions. But to have you dear people intriguing after billets with me would be intolerable." "But what are you going to do?" she cried, wringing her hands. "I'm going for my first omnibus ride tomorrow," said I heroically. Upon which assertion Rogers entered, announcing that her ladyship's carriage had arrived. A while later I accompanied her downstairs and along the arcade. "I should be so miserable thinking of you, poor old boy," she said affectionately, as she bade me good-bye. "Don't. I'm going to enjoy myself for the first time in my life." These were brave odds, but I felt doleful enough when I re-entered the chambers where I had lived in uncomplaining luxury for 14 years. "There's no help for it," I murmured. "I must get rid of the remainder of my lease, sell my books and pictures and other more or less expensive household goods, dismiss Rogers and Bingley, and go and live on 30 shillings a week in a Bloomsbury boarding-house. I think," I continued, regarding myself in the Queen Anne mirror over the mantelpiece, "I think that it will better harmonise with my fallen fortunes if I refrain from waxing the ends of my moustache. There ought to be a modest droop about the moustache of a tax collector." The next morning I gave my servants a month's notice. Rogers, who had been with me for many years, behaved in the correctest manner. He neither offered to lend me his modest savings, nor to work for me for no wages. He expressed his deep regret at leaving my service, and his confidence that I would give him a good character. Bingley wept after the way of women. There was also a shadowy housemaid, young person in a cap, who used to make meteoric appearances, and whom I left to the diplomacy of Bingley. These dismal rites performed, I put my chambers into the hands of a house agent, and interviewed a firm of auctioneers with reference to the sale. It was all exceedingly unpleasant. The agent was so anxious to let my chambers, the auctioneers so delighted at the chance of selling my effects, that I felt myself forthwith turned neck and crop out of doors. It was a bright morning in early spring, with a satirical touch of hope in the air. London, no longer to be my London, maintained its hostile attitude to me. If anyone had prophesied that I should be a stranger in Piccadilly, I should have laughed aloud. Yet I was. Walking moodily up St. James's Street, I met the omniscient and expansive Renniker. He gave me a curt nod and a "How do you do?" and passed on. I felt savagely disposed to slash his jaunty silk hat off with my walking stick. A few months before, he would have rushed effusively into my arms and bedaubed me with miscellaneous inaccuracies of information. At first I was furiously indignant. Then I laughed, and, swinging my stick, nearly wreaked my vengeance on a harmless elderly gentleman. It was my first experience of social ostracism. Although I curled a contumelious lip, I smarted under the indignity. It was all very well to say proudly, "Ion sonio," but Io used to be a person of some importance who was not cavalierly "how do you do'd" by creatures like Renniker. This, and the chance encounters of the next few weeks, gave me furiously to think. I knew that in one respect my sister Agatha was right. These good folks, who shied now at the stains of murder with which my reputation was soiled, would in time get used to them, and eventually forget them altogether. But I reflected that I should not forget, and I determined that I should not be admitted on sufferance, as it should have to be admitted, into any man's club or any woman's drawing-room. One day Colonel Ellerton, Maisie Ellerton's father, called on me. He used to be my very good friend. We sat on the same side of the house and voted together on innumerable occasions in perfect sympathy and common lack of conviction. He was cordial enough, congratulated me on my marvellous restoration to health, deplored my absence from parliamentary life, and then began to talk, confusedly, of Russia. It took a little perspicacity to see that something was weighing on the good man's mind, something he had come to say, and for his honest life could not get out. His plight became more pitiable as the interview proceeded, and when he rose to go, he grew as red as a turkey-cock and began to sputter. I went to his rescue. "It's very kind of you to come to see me, Ellison," I said, "but if I don't call yet a while to pay my respects to your wife, I hope you'll understand and not attribute it to discourtesy." I've never seen relief so clearly depicted on a human countenance. He drew a long breath and instinctively passed his handkerchief over his forehead. Then he grasped my hand. "My dear fellow," he cried, "of course we'll understand it. It was a shocking affair. Terrible for you. My wife and I were quite bowled over by it." I did not attempt to clear myself. What was the use? Every man denies these things as a matter of course, and as a matter of course nobody believes him. Once I ran across Elphin Montgomery, a mysterious personage behind many musical comedy enterprises. He is jewelled all over like a first-class Hindu idol, and is treated as a god in fashionable restaurants, where he entertains riff-raff at sumptuous banquets. I had some slight acquaintance with the fellow, but he greeted me as I were a long-lost intimate. His heavy, sensual face swagged in smiles, and invited me to a supper party. He would not have presumed to ask me to meet his riff-raff before I became disgustingly, and I suppose to some minds fascinatingly, notorious. But now I was hail fellow well met with him, a bird of his own feather, a rogue of his own kidney, to whom he threw open the gates of his bedaubed and befrilled Alsatia. A pestilential fellow, as if I would mortgage my birthright for such a mess of pottage. So I stiffened and bade society, high and low, go packing. I would neither seek mine own people, nor allow myself to be sought by Elphin Montgomery's. I wrapped myself in a fine garment of defiance. My sister Jane, who was harder and more worldly minded than Agatha, would have had me don a helmet of brass and a breastplate of my rhinoceros hide, and force my way through reluctant portals. But Agatha agreed with me, clinging, however, to the hope that time would not only reconcile society to me, but would also reconcile me to society. "If the hope comforts you, my dear Agatha," said I, "by all means cherish it. In the meantime, allow me to observe that the character of Ishmael is eminently suited to the profession of tax-collecting." During these early days of my return, the one person with whom I had no argument was Lola. She soothed where others scratched, and stimulated where others goaded. The intimacy of my convalescence continued. At first I acquainted her, as far as was reasonably necessary, with my change of fortune, and accepted her offer to find me less expensive quarters. The devoted woman personally inspected every flat in London with that insistence of which masculine patience is incapable, and eventually decided on a tiny bachelor suite somewhere in the clouds over a block of flats in Victoria Street, where the service is included in the rent. Into this I moved with such of my furniture as I withdrew from the auctioneer's hammer, and there I prepared to stay until necessity should drive me to the Bloomsbury boarding-house. I thought I would graduate my descent. Before I moved, however, she came to the Albany for the first and only time to see the splendour I was about to quit. In a modest way it was splendour. My chambers were really a large double flat, to the tasteful furnishing of which I had devoted the thought and interest of many years. She went with me through the rooms. The dining-room was all Chippendale, each piece a long-coveted and hunted treasure. The library, old oak. The drawing-room, a comfortable and cunning medley. There were bits of old china, pieces of tapestry, some rare prints, my choice collection of mezzo-tints, a picture or two of value, one a Lancret, a very dear possession. And there were my books. Once I had a passion for rare bindings. Everything had to me a personal significance, and I hated the idea of surrender more than I dared to confess even to myself. But I said to Lola, "Vanity of vanities, all things expensive are vanity." Her eyes glistened, and she slipped her arm through mine and patted the back of my hand. "If you talk like that, I shall cry and make a fool of myself," she said in a broken manner. "It is not so much the thing that is done, or the thing that is said, that matters, but the way of doing it or saying it. In the commonplace pat on the hand, in the break in the commonplace words, there was something that went straight to my heart." I squeezed her arm and whispered, "Thank you, dear." This sympathy, so sure and yet so delicately conveyed, was mine for the trouble of mounting the stairs that led to her drawing-room in Cadogan Gardens. She seemed to be watching my heart the whole time, so without my asking, without my knowledge even, she could touch each sore spot as it appeared with the healing finger. For herself she made no claims, and because she did not in any way declare herself to be unhappy, I, after the manner of men, took her happiness for granted. For lives there a man who does not believe that an uncomplaining woman has nothing to complain of? It is his masculine prerogative of density. Besides, does not he himself, when hurt, bellow like a bull? Why, he argues, should not wounded woman do the same? So, when I wanted companionship, I used to sit in the familiar room and make Adolphus, the chow dog, shoulder arms with the poker, and gossip restfully with Lola, who sprawled in her old, languorous, loose-limbed way among the cushions of her easy chair. Gradually my habitual reserve melted from me, and at last I gave her my whole confidence, telling her of my disastrous pursuit of humority, of Eleanor Faversham, of the attitude of society, in fact, of most of what I have set down in the preceding pages. She was greatly interested in everything, especially in Eleanor Faversham. She wanted to know the colour of her eyes and hair and how she dressed. Women are odd creatures. The weeks passed. Besides ministering to my dilapidated spirit, Lola found occupation in looking after the cattery of Anastasius Papadopoulos, which the little man had left in the charge of his pupil and assistant, Quost. This Quost apparently was a faithful, stolid, but unintelligent and incapable German, who had remained loyally at his post until Lola found him there in a state of semi-starvation. The sum of money with which Anastasius had provided him had been eked out to the last farthing. The cats were in a pitiable condition. Quost, in despair, was trying to make up his dull mind whether to sell them or eat them. Lola, with superb feminine disregard of legal rights, annexed the whole cattery, maintained Quost in his position of pupil and assistant, and informed the landlord that she would be responsible for the rent. Then she set to work to bring the cats into their proper condition of sleekness, and, that done, to put them through a systematic course of training. They had been thoroughly demoralised, she declared, under Quost's maladministration, and had almost degenerated into the unhistrionic pussies of domestic life. As for Hephaestus, the great Tom, he was more like an insane tiger than a cat. He flew at the gate over which he used to jump, and clawed and bit it to matchwood, and not after spitting in fury at the blazing hoop, sprang at the unhappy Quost as if he had been the contriver of the indignities to which he was being subjected. These tales of feline backsliding I used to hear from Lola, and when I asked her why she devoted her energies to the unproductive education of the uninspiring animals, she would shrug her shoulders and regard me with a Gioconda smile. "In the first place, it amuses me. You seem to forget I'm a dompteuse, a tamer of beasts. It's my profession. I was trained to it. It's the only thing I can do, and it's good to feel that I haven't lost my power. It's odd, but I feel a different woman when I'm impressing my will on these wretched cats. You must come one of these days and see a performance when I've got them ship-shape. They'll astonish you. And then," she would add, "I can write to Anastasius and tell him how his beloved cats are getting on." Well, it was an interest in her life, which, heaven knows, was not crowded with exciting incidents. Now that I can look back on these things with a philosophic eye, I can imagine no drearier existence than that of a friendless, unoccupied woman in a flat in Cadogan Gardens. At that time I did not realise this as completely as I might have done. Because our old surgeon friend, Sir Joshua Oldfield, now and then took her out to dinner, I considered she was leading a cheerful, if not a merry, life. I smiled indulgently at Lola's devotion to the cats, and congratulated her on having found another means whereby to beguile the tedium vitae which is the arch enemy of content. "I wish I could find such a means myself," said I. I not only had the wish, but the imperative need to do so. To stand like Ajax defying the lightning is magnificent, but as a continuous avocation it is wearisome and unprofitable, especially if carried on in a tiny bachelor suite and eerie of a place at the top of a block of flats in Victoria Street. Indeed, if it had not added soon to the meagre remains of my fortune, I should not be able to afford the luxury of the bachelor suite. Conscious of this, I left the lightning alone, after a last denunciatory shake of the fist, and descended into the busy ways of men to look for work. Thus I entered on the second stage of my career, that of a soldier of fortune. At first I was doubtful as to what path to glory and bread and butter I could carve out for myself. Hitherto I had been Fortune's darling instead of her mercenary, and she had most politely carved out my paths for me, until she had played her jade's trick and left me in the ditch. Now things were different. I stood alone, ironical, ambitionless, still questioning the utility of human effort, yet determined to play the game of life to its bitter end. What could I do? It is true that I had been called to the bar in my tentative youth, while I drafted documents for my betters to pull to pieces and rewrite at the Foreign Office. But I had never seen a brief. My memories of Gaius, Justinian, Williams's Real Property, and Austin's Jurisprudence were as nebulous as those of the differential calculus over whose facetiae I had pondered during my school days. The law was as clear as medicine. I had no profession. I therefore drifted into the one pursuit for which my training had qualified me, namely, political journalism. I had written much in my amateur way during my 10 years' membership of Parliament. Why, I hardly know, not because I needed money, not because I had thoughts which I burned to express, and certainly not through vain desire of notoriety. Perhaps the motive was twofold: an ingrained delight in the incongruous. It seemed incongruous for an airy Epicurean like myself to spend stodgy hours writing stodgier articles on pauper lunacy and poor law administration, and the same inherited sense of gentlemanly obligation to do something for one's king and country as made my ancestors, whether they liked it or not, clothe themselves in uncomfortable iron garments and go about fighting other gentlemen similarly clad, to their own great personal danger. At any rate, it complemented my work at St. Stephen's, and doubtless contributed to a reputation in the House which I did not gain through my oratory. I could therefore bring to editors the stock in trade of a fairly accurate knowledge of current political issues, an appreciation of personalities, and a philosophical subritant estimate of the bubbles that are for ever rising on the political surface. I found Finch of the Universal Review, James of the Weekly, and one or two others more than willing to give me employment. I put my pen also at the disposal of Raggles. It was as uplifting and about as mechanical as tax collecting, but it involved less physical exertion and less unpleasant contact with my fellow creatures. I could also keep the ends of my moustache waxed, which was a great consolation. My sister Agatha commended my courage and energy, and Lola read my articles with a glowing enthusiasm, which compensated for lack of exact understanding. But I was not proud of my position. It is one thing to stand at the top of a marble staircase, and in a debonair, jesting fashion, to fling insincere convictions to a recipient world. It is another to sell the same worthless commodity for money. I began, to my curious discomfort, to suspect that life had a meaning after all. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 18. One day I had walked from Cadogan Gardens with a gadfly phrase of Lola's tormenting my ears. "You're not quite alive even yet." I had spent most of the day over a weekly article for James's high-toned periodical, using the same old shibboleths, proclaiming Gilead to be the one place for balm, juggling with the same old sophistries, and proving that Pope must have been out of his mind when he declared that an honest man was the noblest work of God, seeing that nobler than the most honest man was the disingenuous government held up to eulogy. And I had gone, tired, dispirited, out with myself, to Lola for tea and consolation. I had not been the merriest company. I had spoken gloomily of the cosmos, and when Adolphus the chow dog had walked down the room in his hind legs, I had railed at the futility of canine effort. To Lola, who had put forth all her artillery of artless and harmless coquetry in voice and gesture in order to lure my thoughts into pleasanter ways, I exhibited the querulous grumpiness of a spoiled village octogenarian. We discussed the weather, which was worth discussing, for the spring, after long tarrying, had come. It was early May. Lola laughed. The spring has got into my blood. It hasn't got into mine, I declared. It never will. I wonder what the deuce is the matter with me. Then Lola had said, My dear Simon, I know. You're not quite alive even yet. I walked homewards, pestered by the phrase. What did she mean by it? I stopped at the island round the clock tower by Victoria Station and bought a couple of newspapers. There, in the centre of the whirlpool, where swam dizzily omnibuses, luggage-laden cabs, whirling motors, feverish, train-saking humans, dirty newsboys, I stood, absently saying to myself, You're not quite alive even yet. A hand gripped my arm, and a cheery voice said, Hello. I started and recognised Rex Campion. I also said, Hello, and shook hands with him. We had not met since the days when, having heard of my Monte Cristo lavishness, he had called at the Albany and had beguiled me into giving £1,000 to his beloved Barbara's Building, the prodigious philanthropic institution which it founded in the slums of South Lambeth. In spite of my dead and dazed state of being, I was pleased to see his saturnine black-bearded face and to hear his big voice. He was one of those men who always talked like a megaphone. The porticos of Victoria Station re-echoed with his salutations. I greeted him less vociferously, but with equal cordiality. You're looking very fit. I hear that you've gone through a miraculous operation. How are you? Perfectly well, said I, but I've been told that I'm not quite alive even yet. He looked anxious. Remains of trouble? Not a vestige, I laughed. That's all right, he said breezily. Now come along and hear Milligan speak. It did not occur to him that I might have work, worries, or engagements, or that the evening's entertainment which he offered me might be the last thing I should appreciate. His head, for the moment, was full of Milligan, and it seemed to him only natural that the head of all humanity should be full of Milligan too. I made a wry face. That son of thunder? Milligan was a demagogue who had twice unsuccessfully attempted to get into Parliament in the Labour interest. Have you ever heard him? Heaven forbid, said I in my pride. Then come, he's speaking at the hall of the Lambeth Biblical Society. I was tempted, as I wanted company. In spite of my high resolve to out-Ishmael Ishmael, I could not kill the highly developed gregarious instinct. I also wanted a text for an article, but I wanted my dinner still more. Campion condemned the idea of dinner. You can have a cold supper, he roared, like the rest of us. I yielded. Campion dragged me helpless to a tram at the top of Vauxhall Bridge Road. It will do your mightiness good to mingle with the proletariat, he grinned. I did not tell him that I had been mingling with it in this manner for some time past, or that I repudiated the suggestion of its benign influence. I entered the tram meekly. As soon as we were seated, he began, I bet you won't guess what I've done with your £1,000. I'll give you 1,000,000 guesses. As I am a poor conjecturer, I put on a blank expression and shook my head. He waited for an instant and then shouted with an air of triumph, I've found it a prize, my boy, a stroke of genius. I've called it by your name, the De Gex Prize for Housewives. I didn't bother you about it as I knew you were in a world of worry, but just think of it, an annual prize of £30, practically the interest, for housewives. His eyes flashed in his enthusiasm. He brought his heavy hand down on my knee. Well, I asked, not electrified by this announcement. Don't you see, he exclaimed, I throw the competition open to the women in the district, with certain qualifications, you know. I look after all that.
They enter their names by a given date, and then they start fair. The woman who keeps her home tidiest and her children cleanest got a surprise. Isn't it splendid?" I agreed. "How many competitors?" 43. And there they are, working away, sweeping their floor, up clean curtains, and scrubbing their children's noses till they shine like rubies, and making their homes like little Dutch pictures. You see, £30 is a devil a lot of money for poor people. As one mother of a large family said to me, "With that one could build them all quite beautiful." "You're a wonderful fellow," said I, somewhat enviously. He gave an awkward laugh and tugged at his beard. "I'm only happened to find my job, and am doing it as well as I can," he said. "It isn't very much, after all. Sometimes one gets discouraged. People are such ungrateful pigs. But now and again one does help a lame dog over a stile, which bucks one up, you know. Why don't you come down and have a look at us one of these days? You've been promising to do so for years." "I will," said I, with sudden interest. "You can have a peep at one or two of the competing homes. We pop into them unexpectedly at all hours. That's a part of the game. We've a complicated system of marks, which I'll show you. Of course, no woman knows how she's getting on, otherwise many would lose heart." "How do the men like this disconcerting ubiquity of soap and water?" "They love it," he cried. "They're keen on the prize too. Some think they'll grab the lot and have the devil's own drunk when the year's up. But I'll look after that. Besides, when a chap has been living in the pride of cleanliness for a year, he'll get into the way of it and be less likely to make a beast of himself. Anyway, I hope for the best. My God, De Gex, if I didn't hope and hope and hope," he cried earnestly, "I don't know how I should get through anything without hope and a faith in the ultimate good of things." "The same inconvincible optimist?" said I. "Yes, thank heaven. And you?" I paused. There came a self-revelatory flash. "At the present moment," I said, "I am a perfectly convincible vacuist." We left the tram and the main thoroughfare and turned into frowsy streets, peopled with frowsy men and women and raucous with the bickering play of frowsy children. It was still daylight. Over London the spring had fluttered its golden pinions, and I knew that in more blessed quarters, in the great parks, in Piccadilly, in Old Palace Yard, half a mile away, its fragrance lingered, quickening, already quickened by hope, and making happier hearts already happy. But here the ray of spring had never penetrated either that day or the days of former springs, so there was no lingering fragrance. Here no one heeded the aspects of the changing year, save when suffocated by sweltering heat, or frozen in the bitter cold, or drenched by the pouring rain. Otherwise, in these grey, frowsy streets, spring, summer, autumn, winter were all the same to the grey, frowsy people. It is true that youth laughed, animal boys and pale, flat-chested girls, but it laughed chiefly at inane obscenity. One of these days, when phonography is as practicable as photography, someone will make accurate records in these frowsy streets, and then, after the manner of the elegant writers of bucolics and pastorals, publish such a series of urbanics and pavimentals, phonographic dialogues between the Collins and Dulcibellas of the pavement and the gutter as will freeze up hell with horror. An anemic, flirtatious group passed us, the girls in front, the boys behind. "Good God, Cabin, what can you do?" I asked. "Pay them, old chap," he returned quickly. "What's the good of that?" "Good? Oh, I see." He laughed with a touch of scorn. "It's a question of definition. When you see a fellow creature suffering and it shocks your refined susceptibilities, and you say, 'Poor devil,' and pass on, you think you've pitied him. But you haven't. You think pity's a passive virtue. It isn't. If you really pity anybody, you go mad to help him. You don't stand by with tears of sensibility running down your cheeks. You stretch out your hand, because you've damn well got to. If he won't take it or wipes you over the head, that's his lookout. You can't work miracles. But once in a way he does take it, and then, well, you work like hell to pull him through. And if you do, what bigger thing is there in the world than the salvation of a human soul?" "It's worth living for," said I. "It's worth doing any confounded old thing for," he declared. I envied Campion as I had envied no man before. He was alive in heart and soul and brain. I was not quite alive even yet. But I felt better for meeting him. I told him so. He tugged his beard again and laughed. I am a happy old crank. Perhaps that's the reason. At the door of the hall of the Lambeth Ethical Society he stopped short and turned on me. His jaw dropped, and he regarded me in dismay. I'm the flightiest and feather-headedest ass that ever brayed, he informed me. I just remember I sent Miss Faversham a ticket for this meeting about a fortnight ago. I'd clean forgotten it. There's something uncomfortable had been ticking in the back of my head all the time. I'm miserably sorry. I hastened to reassure him. Miss Faversham and I are still good friends. I don't think she'll mind my nodding to her from the other side of the room. Indeed, she had written me 1 or 2 letters since my recovery, perfect in tact and sympathy, and had put her loyal friendship at my service. Even if we meet, I smiled, nothing tragic will happen. He expressed his relief. But what, I asked, is Miss Faversham doing in this galley? I suppose she's displaying an intelligent interest in modern thought, he said, with boyish delight at the chance I had offered him. Touché, said I, with a bow, and we entered the hall. It was crowded. The audience consisted of the better class of artisans, tradesmen, and foremen in factories. There was a sprinkling of black-coated clerks and unskilled labouring men. A few women's hats sprouted here and there among the men's heads like weeds in a desert. There were women, too, in proportionately greater numbers on the platform at the end of the hall, and among them I was quick to notice Eleanor Faversham. As Campion disliked platforms and high places in synagogues, we sat on one of the benches near the door. He explained it was also out of consideration for me. If Milligan is too strong for your proud, aristocratic stomach, he whispered, you can cut and run without attracting attention. Milligan had evidently just begun his discourse. I had not listened to him for 5 minutes, when I found myself caught in the grip which he was famous for fastening on his audience. With his subject, nationalisation of the land, and his arguments, I had been perfectly familiar for years. As a boy I had read Henry George's Progress and Poverty with the superciliousness of the young believer in the divine right of Britain's landed gentry, and before the Eton Debating Society I had demolished the whole theory to my own and everyone else's satisfaction. Later, as a practical politician, I kept myself abreast of the socialist movement. I did not need Mr. John Milligan, whom my lingering flippancy had called a son of thunder, to teach me the elements of the matter. But at this peculiar crisis of my life I felt that, in a queer, unknown way, Milligan had a message for me. It was uncanny. I sat and listened to the exposition of Utopia with the rapt intensity of any cheesemonger's assistant there, before whose captured spirit floated the vision of days to come, when the land should so flow with milk and money that golden cheeses would be like buttercups for the plucking. It was not the man's gospel that fascinated me, nor his illuminated prophecy of the millennium that produced the vibrations in my soul, but the surging passion of his faith, the tempest of his enthusiasm. I had enough experience of public speaking to distinguish between the theatrical and the genuine in oratory. Here was no tub-thumping soothsayer, but an inspired zealot. He lived his impassioned creed in every fibre of his frame and faculties. He was titanic, this rough miner, in his unconquerable hope, divine in his yearning love of humanity. When he ended there was a dead silence for a second, and then a roar of applause from the pale, earnest, city-stamped faces. A lump rose in my throat. Campion clutched my knee. A light burned in his eyes. "Well, what about Boanerges?" "Only one thing," said I. "I wish I were as alive as that man." A negligible person proposed a vote of thanks to Milligan, after which the hall began to empty. Campion, caught by a group of his proletariat friends, signalled to me to wait for him. And as I waited, I saw Eleanor Faversham come slowly from the platform down the central gangway. Her eyes fixed themselves on me at once. For standing there alone I must have been a conspicuous figure, an intruder from the gorgeous west. And with a little start of pleasure she hurried her pace. I made my way past the chattering loiterers in my row and met her, We shook hands. "Well, Saul among the prophets. Who would have thought of seeing you here?" I waved my hand towards Campion. "We have the same sponsor." She glanced at him for a swift instant, and then at me. "Did you like it?" "Have you seen Niagara?" "Yes." "Did you like it?" "I'm so glad," she cried. "I thought perhaps—" She broke off. "Why haven't you tried to see me?" "There are certain conventions." "I know," she said. "They're idiotic." "There's also Mrs. Faversham," said I. "Mother is the dearest thing in life," she replied. "But Mrs. Faversham is a convention." She came nearer to me in order to allow a freer passage down the gangway, and also in order to be out of earshot of an elderly woman who was obviously accompanying her. "Simon, I've been a good friend to you. I believe in you. Nothing will shake my convictions. You couldn't look into my eyes like that if... well, you know." "I couldn't," said I. "Then why can't two honourable, loyal people meet? We only need meet once. But I want to tell you things I can't write, things I can't say here. I also want to hear of things. I think I've got a kind of claim, haven't I?" "I've told you, Eleanor, my letters—" "Letters are rubbish," she declared with a laugh. "Where can we meet?" "Agatha is a good soul," said I. "Well, fix it up by telephone tomorrow." "Alas," said I don't run to telephones in my eagle's nest on Himalaya mansions." She knitted her brows. "That's not the last address you wrote from?" "No," I replied, smiling at this glimpse of the matter-of-fact Eleanor. "It was a joke." "You're incorrigible," she said rebukingly. "I don't joke so well in rags as in silk and motley," I returned with a smile, "but I do my best." She disdained a retort. "We'll arrange anyhow with Agatha." Campion, escaping from his friends, came up and chatted for a minute. Then he saw Eleanor and her companion to the carriage. "Now," said he a moment later, "come to Barbara and have some supper. You won't mind if Jenkins joins us?" "Who's Jenkins?" I asked. "Jenkins is an intelligent gas-fitter of sociological tastes. He classes Herbert Spencer, Benjamin Kidd, and Lombroso as light literature. He also helps us with our young criminals. I should like you to meet him." "I should be delighted," I said. So Jenkins was summoned from a little knot a few yards off and duly presented. Whereupon we proceeded to Campion's plain but comfortably furnished quarters in Barbara's building, where he entertained us till nearly midnight with cold beef and cheese and strenuous conversation. As I walked across Westminster Bridge on my homeward way, it seemed as if London had grown less hostile. Big Ben chimed 12, and there was a distinct Dick Whittington touch about the music. The light on the tower no longer mocked me. As I passed by the gates of Palace Yard, a policeman on duty recognised me and saluted. I strode on with a springier tread and noticed that the next policeman, who did not know me, still regarded me with an air of benevolence. A pale moon shone in the heavens and gave me shyly to understand that she was as much my moon as anyone else's. As I turned into Victoria Street, omnibuses passed me with a lurch of friendliness. The ban was lifted. I danced, figuratively, along the pavement. What it portended I did not realise. I was conscious of nothing but a spiritual exhilaration, comparable only with the physical exhilaration I experienced in the garden at Algiers, when my bodily health had been finally established. As the body then felt the need of expressing itself in violent action, in leaping and running, an impulse which I firmly subdued, so now did my spirit crave some sort of expression in violent emotion. I was in a mood for enraptured converse with an archangel. Looking back, I see that Campion's friendly "hello" had awakened me from a world of shadows and set me among realities. The impact of Milligan's vehement personality had changed the conditions of my life from static to dynamic, and that a providence which is not always as ironical as it pleases us to assert had sent Eleanor Faversham's graciousness to mitigate the severity of the shock. I see how just was Lola's diagnosis. "You're not quite alive even yet." I'd been going about in a state of suspended spiritual animation. My recovery dated from that evening. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19, Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. Agatha proved herself the good soul I had represented her to be. "Certainly, dear," she said when I came the following morning with my request. "You can have my boudoir all to yourselves." "I am grateful," said I, "and for the first time I forgive you for calling it by that abominable name." It was an old quarrel between us. Every lover of language picks out certain words in common use that he hates with an unreasoning ferocity. "I'll change its title if you like," she said meekly. "If you do, my dear Agatha, my gratitude will be eternal. I remember a certain superior person, when Tom and I were engaged, calling Mother's boudoir, the only quiet place in the house, the osculatorium." She laughed with the air of a small bird who, after long waiting, had at last got even with a hawk. But I did not even smile. For the only time in our lives I considered that Agatha had committed a breach of good taste. I said rather stiffly, "It is not going to be a lovers' meeting, my dear." She flushed. "It was silly of me. But why shouldn't it be a lovers' meeting?" she added audaciously. "If nothing had happened, you two would have been married by this time." "Not till June." "Oh, yes, you would. I should have seen about that. A ridiculously long engagement. Anyhow, it was only your illness that broke it off. You were told that you were going to die. You did the only honourable and sensible thing, both of you. Now you're in splendid health again." "Stop, stop," I interrupted. "You seem to be entirely oblivious of the circumstances." "I am oblivious of no circumstances, neither is Eleanor. And if she still cares for you, she won't care twopence for the circumstances. I know I wouldn't." And to cut off my reply, she clapped the receiver of the telephone to her ear and called up Eleanor, with whom she proceeded to arrange a date for the interview. Presently she screwed her head round. "She says she can come at 4 this afternoon. Will that suit you?" "Perfectly," said I. When she replaced the receiver, I stepped behind her and put my hands on her shoulders. "The mother of mischief," I quoted, "is no bigger than a midge's wing, and the grandmother is the match-making microbe that lurks in every woman's system." She caught one of my hands and looked up into my face. "You're not cross with me, Simon?" Her tone was that of the old Agatha. I laughed, remembering the policeman's salute of the previous night, and noted this recovery of my ascendancy as another indication of the general improvement in the attitude of London. "Of course not, Tomtit," said I, calling her by her nursery name. "But I absolutely forbid your thinking of playing fairy godmother." "You can forbid my playing," she laughed, "and I can obey you, but you can't prevent my thinking. Thought is free." "Sometimes, my dear," I retorted, "it is better chained up." With this rebuke I left her. No doubt she considered a renewal of my engagement with Eleanor Faversham a romantic solution of difficulties. I could only regard it as preposterous, and as I walked back to Victoria Street I convinced myself that Eleanor's frank offer of friendship proved that such an idea never entered her head. I took vehement pains to convince myself spring had come. Like the year, I had awaked my lethargy. I viewed life through new eyes. I felt it with a new heart. Such vehement pains I was not capable of taking yesterday. "It has never entered her head," I declare conclusively. And yet, as we sat together a few hours later in Agatha's little room, a doubt began to creep into the corners of my mind. In her strong way she had brushed away the scandal that hung around my name. She did not believe a word of it. I told her of my loss of fortune. My lunacy rather raised than lowered me in her esteem. How then was I personally different from the man she had engaged herself to marry 6 months before? I remembered our parting. I remembered her letters. Her presence here was proof of her unchanging regard. But was it something more? Was there a hope throbbing beneath that calm, sweet surface to which I did not respond? For it often happens that the more direct a woman is, the more in her feminine heart is she elusive. Clean-built, clean-hearted, clean-eyed, of that clean complexion which suggests the open air, Eleanor impressed you with a sense of bodily and mental wholesomeness. Her taste in dress ran in the direction of plain, tailor-made gowns. I am told, by the way, that these can be fairly expensive, and shrank instinctively from the frills and fripperies to which daughters of Eve are notoriously addicted.
She spoke in a clear voice which some called hard, though I never found it so. She carried herself proudly. Chaste in thought, frank in deed, she was a perfect specimen of the highly bred, purely English type of woman, who, looking at facts squarely in the face, accepts them as facts, and does not allow her imagination to dally in any atmosphere wherein they may be invested. To this type, a vow is irrefragable. Loyalty is inherent in her like her blood. She never changes. What feminine inconsistencies she had at 15, she retains at 25, and preserves to add to the charms of her old age. She is the exemplary wife, the great-hearted mother of children. She sent her sons in thousands to fight her country's battles overseas. Those things which lie in the outer temper of her soul she gives lavishly. That which is hidden in her inner shrine has to be wrested from her by the one hand she loves. Was mine that hand? It will be perceived that I was beginning to take life seriously. Eleanor must have also perceived something of the sort, for during our talk she said irrelevantly, "You've changed." "In what way?" I asked. "I don't know. You're not the same as you were. I seem to know you better in some ways, and yet I seem to know you less. Why is it?" I said, "No one can go through the valley of the grotesque, as I have done, without suffering some change." "I don't see why you should call it the valley of the grotesque." I smiled at her instinctive rejection of the fanciful. "Don't you? Call it the valley of the shadow, if you like. But don't you think the attendant circumstances were rather medieval, gargoyle-y, organesque? Don't you think the whole passage lacked the dignity which one associates with the valley of the shadow of death?" "You mean the murder?" she said, with a faint shiver. "That might be termed the central feature. Just look at things as they happened. I am condemned to death. I try to face it like a man and a gentleman. I make my arrangements. I give up what I can call mine no longer. I think I will devote the rest of my days to performing such acts of helpfulness and charity as would be impossible for a sound man with a long life before him to undertake. I do it in a half-jesting spirit, refusing to take death seriously. I pledge myself to an act of helpfulness which I regard at first as merely an incident in my career of beneficence. I am gradually caught in the tangle of a drama which at times develops into sheer burlesque, and before I can realise what is going to happen, it turns into ghastly tragedy. I am overwhelmed in grotesque disaster. It's the only word. Instead of creating happiness all around me, I have played havoc with human lives. I stand on the brink and look back and see that it is all one gigantic devil jest at my expense. I thank God I am going to die. I do die, for practical purposes. I come back to life, and here I am. Can I be quite the same person I was a year ago?" She reflected for a few moments. Then she said, "No, you can't be quite the same. A man of your nature would either have his satirical view of life hardened into bitter cynicism, or he would be softened by suffering and face things with new and nobler ideals. He would either still regard life as a jest, but instead of its being an odd, merry jest, it would be a green, meaningless, hideous one, or he would see that it wasn't a jest at all, but a full, wonderful, big reality. I have expressed myself badly, but you see what I mean." "And what do you think has happened?" I asked. "I think you have changed for the better." I smiled inwardly. It sounded rather dull. I said with a smile, "You never liked my cap and bells, Eleanor?" "No," she replied emphatically. "What's the use of mockery? See where it led you." I rose, half laughing at her earnestness, half ashamed of myself, and took a couple of turns across the room. "You're right," I cried. "It led me to perdition. You might make an allegory out of my career and entitle it The Mocker's Progress." I paused for a second or two, and then said suddenly, "Why did you from the first refuse to believe what everybody else does, before I have the chance of looking you in the eyes?" She averted her face. "You forget that I had had the chance of searching deep beneath her." I cannot, in reverence to her, set down what she said she found there. I stood, humbled and rebuked, as a man must do when the best in him is laid out before his sight by a good woman. A maidservant brought in tea, set the table, and departed. Eleanor drew off her gloves, and my glance fell on her right hand. "It's good of you to wear my ring today," I said. "Today?" she echoed, with the tiniest touch of injury in her voice. "Do you think I put it on to just please you today?" "It would have been gracious of you to do so," said I. "It wouldn't," she declared. "It would have been mawkish and sentimental. When we parted, I told you to do what you liked with the ring. Do you remember? You put it on this finger," she waved her right hand, "and there it has stayed ever since." I caught the hand and touched it lightly with my lips. She coloured faintly. "2 lumps of sugar and no milk? I think that's right." She handed me the teacup. "It's like you not to have forgotten." "I'm a practical person," she replied with a laugh. Presently she said, "Tell me more about your illness, or rather your recovery. I know nothing except that you had a successful operation, which all the London surgeons said was impossible." "Who nursed you?" "I had a trained nurse," said I. "Wasn't Madame Brandt with you?" "Yes," said I. "She was very good to me. In fact, I think I owe her my life." Hitherto the delicacy of the situation had caused me to refer to Lola no more than was necessary, and in my narrative I had purposely left her vague. "That's a great debt," said Eleanor. "It is indeed." "You're not the man to leave such a debt unpaid." "I try to repay it by giving Madame Brandt my devoted friendship." Her eyes never wavered as they held mine. "That's one of the things I wanted to know. Tell me something about her." I felt some surprise, as Eleanor was of a nature too proud for curiosity. "Why do you want to know?" "Because she interests me intensely. Is she young?" "About 32.
"Good-looking?"
"She is a woman of remarkable personality."
"Describe her."
I tried, stumbled, and halted. The effort evoked in my mind a picture of Lola, lithe, seductive, exotic, with gold flecks in her dusky, melting eyes, with strong, shapely arms that had as yet only held me motherwise, with her pantherine suggestion of tremendous strength in languorous repose, with her lazy gestures and parted lips showing the wonderful white, even teeth, with all her fascination and charm. A picture of Lola such as I had not seen since emergence from the valley. A picture of Lola generous, tender, wistful, strong, yielding, fragrant, lovable, desirable, amorous. A picture of Lola which I could not put before this other woman equally brave and straight, who looked at me composedly out of her calm blue eyes. My description resolved itself into a loutish catalogue.
"It is not painful to you to talk of her, Simon?"
"Not at all. There are not many great-hearted women going about. It is my privilege to know 2.
"Am I the other?"
"Who else?"
"I'm glad you've had the courage to class Madame Brandt and I together."
"Why?" I asked.
"It proves beyond a doubt that you are honest with me. Now tell me about a few externals, things that don't matter, but help one to form an impression. Is she educated?"
"From books, no. From observation, yes."
"Her manners?"
Observation had educated them.
"Accent?"
"She is sufficiently polyglot to have none."
"She dresses and talks and behaves generally like a lady?"
"She does," said I.
"In what way, then, does she differ from the women of our class?"
"She is less schooled,
"Less reticent?"
franker, more natural. What is on her tongue to say, she says."
"Temper?"
I have never heard her say an angry word to or of a human creature."
"She has queer delicacies of feeling. For instance?"
I told her of Annas Papadopoulos's tawdry, gimcrack presence, which Lola had suffered to remain in her drawing-room so as not to hurt the poor little wretch.
"That's very touching. Where does she live?"
"She has a flat in Cadogan Gardens."
"Is she in London now?"
"Yes."
"I should like very much to know her," she said calmly.
I vow and declare again that the more straightforward and open-eyed, the less subtle, temperamental, and neurotic are women, the more are they baffling. I wonder for some time whither the catechism tended. and now with a sudden jerk it stopped short at this most unexpected terminus. It was startling. I rose and mechanically placed my empty teacup on the tray by her side. "The wish, my dear Eleanor," said I, quite formally, "does great credit to your heart." There was a short pause, marking an automatic close of the subject. Deeply as I admired both women, I shrank from the idea of their meeting. It seemed curiously indelicate, in view both of the former engagement to Eleanor and of Lola's frank avowal of her feelings towards me before what I shall always regard as my death. It is true that we had never alluded to it since my resurrection, but what of that? Lola's feelings, I was sure, remained unaltered. It also flashed on me that, with all the goodwill in the world, Eleanor would not understand Lola. An interview would develop into a duel. I pictured it for a second, and my sudden fierce partisanship for Lola staggered me. Decidedly an acquaintance between these two was preposterous. The silence was definite enough to mark a period, but not long enough to cause embarrassment. Eleanor commented on my present employment. I must find it good to get back to politics. "I find it to the contrary," said I with a laugh. "My convictions, always lukewarm, are now stone cold. I don't say that the principles of the party are wrong, but they're wrong for me, which is all important. If they are not right for me, what care I how right they be? And as I don't believe in those of the other side, I'm going to give up politics altogether." "What will you do?" "I don't know, I honestly don't. But I have an insistent premonition that I shall soon find myself doing something utterly idiotic, which to me will be the most real thing in life." I had indeed awakened that morning with an exhilarating thrill of anticipation, comparable to that of the mountain climber who knows not what panorama of glory may be disclosed to his eyes when he reaches the summit. I had whistled in my bath, a most unusual thing. "Are you going to turn socialist?" "Quilo, sir, I'm willing to turn anything alive and honest. It doesn't matter what a man professes, so long as he professes it with all the faith of all his soul." I broke into a laugh, for the echo of my words rang comic in my ears. "Why do you laugh?" she asked. "Don't you think it funny to hear me talk like a Tupney Carlyle?" "Not a bit," she said seriously. "I can't undertake to talk like that always," I said warningly. "I thought you said you were going to be serious." "So I am, but platitudinous, heaven forbid." The little clock on the mantelpiece struck 6. Eleanor rose in alarm. "How the time has flown! I must be getting back." "Well?" Our eyes met. "Well?" said I. "Are we ever to meet again?" "It's for you to say." "No," she said, and very, very distinctly, very deliberately. "It's for you." I understood. She made the offer simply, nobly, unreservedly. My heart was filled with great gratitude. She was so true, so loyal, so thorough. Why could I not take her at her word? I murmured, "I remember what you say." She put out her hand. "Goodbye." "Goodbye, and God bless you," I said. I accompanied her to the front door, hailed a passing cab, and waited till she had driven off. Was there ever a sweeter, grander, more loyal woman? The 3 little words had changed the current of my being. I returned to take leave of Agatha. I found her in the drawing-room reading a novel. She twisted her head sideways and regarded me with a bird-like air of curiosity. "Eleanor gone?" Her tone jarred on me. I nodded and dropped into a chair. "Interview passed off satisfactorily?" "We were quite comfortable, thank you. The only drawback was the tea. Why a woman in your position can't give people China tea instead of that Ceylon syrup will be a mystery to me to my dying day." She rose in her wrath and shook me. "You're the most aggravating wretch on earth." "My dear Tom Tit," said I gravely, "remember the moral tale of Bluebird." "Look here, Simon." She planted herself in front of me. "I'm not a bit inquisitive. I don't in the least want to know what passed between you and Eleanor. But what I would give my ears to understand is how you can go through a 2 hours' conversation with the girl you were engaged to, a conversation which must have affected the lives of both of you, and then come up to me and talk drivel about China tea and bluebird." "Once on a time, my dear," said I flattered myself on being an artist in life. I am humbler now, and acknowledge myself a wretched, bungling amateur. But I still recognise the value of chiaroscuro." "You're hopeless," said Agatha somewhat crossly. "You get more flippant and cynical every day." End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. I went home to my solitary dinner, and afterwards took down a volume of Emerson and tried to read. I thought the cool and spacious philosopher might allay a certain fever in my blood. But he did nothing of the kind. He wrote for cool and spacious people like himself, not for corpses like me revivified suddenly with an overcharge of vital force. I pitched him, how much more truly companionable is a book than its author, I pitched him across the room, and thrusting my hands into my pockets and stretching out my legs, stared in a certain wonder at myself. I, Simon de Gex, was in love, and, Holly Benedict too, in love with two women at once. It was Oriental, Mormonic, New Century, what you will, but there it was. I am ashamed to vow that if at that moment both women had appeared before me and said, "Marry us," I should have, reflected seriously on the proposal. I passed through curious enough experiences, heaven knows, already, but none so baffling as this. The two women alternately and knocked at my heart and whispered in my ear their irrefutable claims to my love. I listened throbbingly to each, and to each I said, "I love you." I was in an extraordinary psychological predicament. Lola had remarked, "You're not quite alive even yet." I had come to complete life too suddenly. This was the result. I got up and paced the birdcage, which the house agents termed a reception room, and wondered whether I were going mad. It was not as if one woman represented the flesh and the other the spirit. Then I might have seen the way to a decision. But both have the large nature that comprises all. I could not exalt one in any way to the abasement of the other. All my inherited traditions, prejudices, predilections, all my training ranged me on the side of Eleanor. I was clamouring for the real. Was she not the incarnation of the real? Her very directness piqued me to a perverse and delicious obliquity. And I knew, as I knew when I parted from her months before, that it was only for me to awaken things that lay virginally dormant. On the other hand stood Lola, with her magnetic seduction, her rich atmosphere, her great wide simplicity of heart, holding out arms into which I longed to throw myself. It was monstrous, abnormal. I hated the abominable indelicacy of weighing one against the other, as I had hated the idea of their meeting. I paced my page until it shrank to the size of a rat trap. Then I clapped on my hat and fled down into the streets. I jumped into the first cab I saw and bade the driver take me to Barbara's building. Campion suddenly occurred to me as the best antidote to the poison that had entered my blood. I found him alone, clearing from the table the remains of supper. In spite of his soul's hospitable instincts, he stared at me. "Why, what the—" "Yes, I know, you're surprised to see me bursting in on you like a wild animal. I'm not going to do it every night, but this evening I'd claim a bit of our old friendship." "Claim it all, my dear de Gex," he said cordially. "What can I do for you?" It was characteristic of Campion to put his question in that form. 99 men out of 100 would have asked what was the matter with me. But Campion, who all his life had given, wanted to know what he could do. "Tell me fairy tales of Lambeth and idylls of the Waterloo Bridge Road, or light your pipe and talk to me of Barbara." He folded up the tablecloth and put it in the sideboard drawer. "If it's elegant distraction you want," said he, "I can do better than that." He put himself in front of me. "Would you like to do a night's real work?" "Certainly," said I. A gentleman of my acquaintance named Judd is in that ramping stage of delirium tremens. He requires a couple of men to hold him down so as to prevent him from getting out of bed and smashing his furniture and his wife and things. I was going to relieve one of the fellows there now, so that he can get a few hours' sleep, and if you like to come and relieve the other, you'll be doing a good action. But I warn you, it won't be funny. I'm in the mood for anything, I said. You'll come? Of course. That's splendid, he shouted. I hardly thought you were in earnest. Wait till I telephone for some medicine to be sent up from the dispensary. I promise to take it round with me. He telephoned instructions, and presently a porter brought in the medicine. Campion explained that it had been prescribed by the doctor attached to the institution who was attending the case. You must come and see the working of our surgery and dispensary, he cried enthusiastically. We charge those who can afford a sixpence for visit and medicine. Those who can't are provided, after inquiry, with coupons. We don't want to encourage the well-to-do to get their medical advice gratis, or we wouldn't be able to cope with the really poor. We pay the doctor a fixed salary and the fees go to the general fund of the building, so it doesn't matter a hang to him whether a patient pays or not. You must be proud of all this, Campion, I said. In a way, he replied, lighting his pipe, but it's mainly a question of money. My poor old father's money which he worked for, not I. I reminded him that other sons had been known to put their poor old father's money to baser uses. I suppose Barbary is more useful to the community than steam yachts or racing stables. But there, you see, I hate yachting, because I'm always seasick, and I scarcely know which end of a horse you put the bridle on. Every man to his job. This is mine. I like it. I wonder whether holding down people suffering from delirium tremens is my job, said I. If so, I'm afraid I shan't like it. If it's really your job, replied Campion, you will. You must. You can't help it. God made man so. It was only an hour or two later, when, for the first time in my life, I came into practical touch with human misery, that I recognised the truth of Campion's perfervid optimism. No one could like our task that night in its outer essence. For a time it me. The atmosphere of the close, dirty room, bedroom, kitchen, dining room, sitting room, bathroom, laundry, all in one, the home of man, wife and 2 children, caught me by the throat. It was sour. The physical contact with the flesh of the unclean, gibbering, shivering, maniacal brute on the foul bed was unutterably repugnant to me. Now and again, during intervals of comparative calm, I was forced to put my head out of the window to breathe the air of the street. Even that was tainted, for a fried fish shop across the way and a public house next door billowed forth their nauseating odours. After a while, access to the window was denied me. A mattress and some rude coverings were stretched beneath it, the children's bed, on which we persuaded the helpless, dreary wife to lie down and try to rest. A neighbour had taken in the children for the night. The wife was a skinny, grey-faced, lined woman of 26. In her attitude of hopeless incompetence, she shed around her an atmosphere of unspeakable depression. Although I could not get to the window, I was glad when she lay down and spared me the sight of her moving fecklessly around the room, or weeping huddled up on the broken-back wooden chair, and looking more like a half-animated dish-clout than a woman. The poor wretch on the bed was a journeyman tailor, who, when sober, could earn fair wages. The cry of the wife, before Campion awed her into comparative silence, was the monotonous upbraiding of her husband for bringing them down to this poverty. It seemed impossible to touch her intelligence and make her understand that no words from her or anyone could reach his consciousness. His violence, his screams, his threats, the horrors of his fear left her unmoved. We were there to guard her from physical danger, and that to her was all that mattered. In the course of an hour or so, the nausea left me. I felt braced by the grimness of the thing, and during the paroxysms I had no time to think of anything but the mechanical work in hand. It was all that Campion and I, both fairly able-bodied men, could do to keep the puny little tailor in his bed. Horrible shapes menaced him from which he fought madly to escape. He writhed and shrieked with terror. Once he caught my hand in his teeth and bit it, and Campion had some difficulty in relaxing the wretch's jaw. Between the paroxysms, Campion and I sat on the bed watching him, scarcely exchanging a word. The wife, poor creature, whimpered on her mattress. It was not a pleasant vigil. It lasted till the grey dawn crept in, pitilessly intensifying the squalor of the room, and until the dawn was broadening into daylight. Then 2 of Campion's men from Barbara's building arrived to relieve us. Before we went, however, the neighbour who had taken charge of the children came in to help the slatternly wife light a fire and make some tea. I've enjoyed few things more than the warm, bitter stuff which I drank out of the broken mug in that strange and depressing company. I went out into the street with racked head and nerves and muscles. Campion kept his cloth cap in his hand, allowing the morning wind to ruffle his shaggy black hair, and drew a long breath. I think the worst is over now. As soon as he can be moved out of the annex at Broadstairs, the sea air will pull him round. Isn't it rather hopeless? I asked. He turned on me. Nothing's hopeless. If you want to start the hopeless game down here, you'd better distribute cyanide of potassium instead of coals and groceries. I've made up my mind to get that man decent again, and by George I'm going to do it. Fancy those 2 weaklings producing healthy offspring. But they have. 2 of the most intelligent kids in the district. If you hold up your hands and say it's awful to contemplate their upbringing, you're speaking the blatant truth. It's the contemplation that's awful. But why contemplate when you can do something? I admitted the justice of the remark. He went on. Look at yourself now. If you'd gone in with me last night and just stared at the poor devil howling with DT in that filthy place, you'd have come out sick and said it was awful. Instead of that, you buckled to and worked and threw off everything save our common humanity and got interested in the Judds in spite of yourself. You'll go and see them again and do what you can for them, won't you? I was not in a merry mood, but I laughed. Campion had read the intention that had vaguely formulated itself in the back of my mind. Of course I will, I said. We walked on a few steps down the still silent, disheartening street without speaking. Then he tugged his beard, half-halted, and glanced at me quickly. See here, said he, the more sensible people I can get in to help us, the better. Would you like me to hand you over the Judd family en bloc? This was startling to the amateur philanthropist, but it is the way of all professionals to regard their own business as of absorbing interest to the outside world. The stockbroking mind cannot conceive a sane man indifferent to the fluctuations of the money market, and to the professional cricketer the wide earth revolves around a wicket. How in the world could I be fairy godmother to the Judd family? Campion took my competence for granted. You may not understand exactly what I mean, my dear Campion, said I, but I attribute the most unholy disasters of my life to a ghastly attempt of mine to play Deputy Providence. But who's asking you to play Deputy Providence? He shouted. It's the very last idiot thing I want done. I want you to do certain definite practical work for that family under the experienced direction of the authorities at Barbara's building. There, do you understand now? Very well, I'll do anything you like. Thus it befell that I undertook to look after the moral, material, and spiritual welfare of the family of an alcoholic tailor by the name of Judd, who dwelt in a vile slum in South Lambeth. My head was full of the prospect when I awoke at noon, for I had gone exhausted to sleep as soon as I reached home. If goodwill, backed by the experience of Barbara's building, could do aught towards the alleviation of human misery, I determined that it should be done. And there was much misery to be alleviated in the Judd family. I had no clear notion of the means whereby I was to accomplish this, but I knew that it would be a philanthropic pursuit, far different from my previous humorous wanderings about London, when, with a mind conscious of well-doing, I distributed embarrassing £5 notes to the poor and needy. I had known, what comfortable well-fed gentleman does not, that within easy walking distance of his London home thousands of human beings live like the beasts that perish. But never before had I spent an intimate night in one of the foul dens where the living and perishing take place. The awful pity of it entered my soul. So deeply was I impressed with the responsibility of what I had undertaken, so grimly was I haunted by the sight of the pallid, howling travesty of a man and the squeezed-out, whimpering woman, that the memory of the conflicting emotions that had driven me to Campion the night before returned to me with a shock. "It strikes me," I murmured as I shaved, "that I am living very intensely indeed. Here I am in love with two men at once, and almost hysterically enthusiastic over a delirious tailor." Then I cut my cheek and murmured no more until the operation was concluded. I had arranged to accompany Lola that afternoon to the zoological gardens. This was a favourite resort of hers. She was on intimate terms with keepers and animals, and her curious magnetism allowed her to play such tricks with lions and tigers and other ferocious beasts as made my blood run cold. As for the bears, they greeted her approach with shrieking demonstrations of affection. On such occasions I felt the same curious physical antipathy as I did when she dominated Anastasius's ill-conditioned cat. She seemed to enter another sphere of being in which neither I nor anything human had a place. With such dim thoughts in my head, I reached her door in Cadogan Gardens. The sight of her electric brougham that stood waiting switched my thoughts into another groove, but one running oddly parallel. Electric brooms also carried her out of my sphere. I had humbly performed the journey thither in an omnibus. She received me in her big, expansive way. "Lord, how good it is to see you. I was going to say the blind hump, but you don't like it. I was going to turn crazy and bite the furniture." "Why?" I asked with masculine directness. "I've been trying to educate myself to read poetry. Look here." She caught a small brown-covered octavo volume from the table. "I can't make head or tail of it. It proved to me that it was no use. If I couldn't understand poetry, I couldn't understand anything. It was no good trying to educate myself. I gave it up. And then I got what you didn't like to call the hump." "You dear Lola," I cried, laughing. "I don't believe anyone has ever made head or tail out of Sordello. There once was a man who said there were only two intelligible lines in the poem, the first and the last, and that both were lies. 'Who will may hear Sordello's story told,' and 'who would has heard Sordello's story told.' Don't worry about not understanding it." "Don't you?" "Not a bit," said I. "That's a comfort," she said with a generous sigh of relief. "How well you're looking," she cried suddenly. "You're a different man. What have you been doing to yourself?" "I've grown quite alive." "Good, delightful. So am I. Quite alive now, thank you." She looked it in spite of the black outdoor costume, but there was a dash of white at her throat and some white lilies of the valley in her bosom, and a white feather in her great black hat poised with a Gainsborough swagger on the mass of her bronze hair. "It's the spring," she added. "Yes," said I, "it's the spring." She approached me and brushed a few specks of dust from my shoulder. "You want a new suit of clothes, Simon?" "Dear me," said I, glancing hastily over the blue serge suit in which I had lounged at Mustapha Superior. "I suppose I do." It occurred to me that my wardrobe generally needed replenishing. I had been unaccustomed to think of these things, the excellent Rogers and his predecessors having done most of the thinking for me. "I'll go to Poole's at once," said I. And then it struck me to my whimsical dismay that in the present precarious state of my finances, especially in view of my decision to abandon political journalism in favour of I knew not what occupation, I could not afford to order clothes largely from a fashionable tailor. I shouldn't have mentioned it," said Lola apologetically, "but you're always so spick and span." And now I'm getting shabby. I threw back my head and laughed at the new and comical conception of Simon de Gex down at heel. "Oh, not shabby," echoed Lola. "Yes, my dear, the days of purple and fine linen are vorbei. You'll have to put up with me in a threadbare coat and frayed cuffs and ragged hems to my trousers." Lola declared that I was talking rubbish. "Not quite such rubbish as you may think, my dear. Shall you mind?" "It would break my heart. But why do you talk so? You can't be as poor as that." Her face manifested such tragic concern that I laughed. Besides, the idea of personal poverty amused me. When I gave up my political work, I should only have what I have saved from my wreck, some 200 a year, to support me until I should find some other means of livelihood. It was enough to keep me from starvation, and the little economies I had begun to practice afforded me enjoyment. On the other hand, how folks regulated their balance sheets so as to live on £200 a year, I had but a dim notion. In the course of our walk from Barbara's building to the Judds the night before, I had asked Campion. He had laughed somewhat grimly. "I don't know. I don't run an asylum for spendthrift plutocrats. But if you want to see how people live and bring up large families on 15 shillings a week, I can show you heaps of examples." This, I felt, would in itself be knowledge of the deepest interest, but it would in no way aid me to solve my own economic difficulty. I had always been brought up suddenly against the problem in some form or another, and as I say, it caused me considerable amusement. "I shall go on happily enough," said I, reassuringly. "In the meantime, let us go and see the lions and tigers." We started. The electric brougham glided along comfortably through the sunlit streets. A feeling of physical and spiritual content stole over me. Our hands met and lingered a long time in a sympathetic clasp. Whatever fortune held in store for me here, at least I had an inalienable possession. For some time we said nothing, and when our eyes met, she smiled. I think she had never felt my heart so near to hers. At last we broke the silence and talked of ordinary things. I told her of my vigil overnight and my undertaking to look after the Judds. She listened with great interest. When I had finished my tale, she said almost passionately, "Oh, I wish I could do something like that." "You?" "Why not? I came from those people. My grandfather swept the cages and jam racks down by the docks. He died of drink. He used to live in one horrible squalid room nearby. I remember my father taking me to see him when I was a little girl. We ourselves weren't very much better off at that time." "I've been through it," she shivered. "I know what that awful poverty is. Sometimes it seems immoral of me to live luxuriously as I do now, without doing a hand's turn to help." "Chacun a son métier, my dear," said I. "There's no need to reproach yourself." "But I think it might be my métier," she replied earnestly, "if only I could learn it." "Why haven't you tried then?" "I've been lazy, and the opportunity hasn't come my way." "I'll introduce you to Campion," I said, "and doubtless he'll be able to find something for you to do. He's made a science of the matter. I'll take you down to see him. Will you?" "Certainly," said I. There was a pause, and an idea struck me. "I wonder, my dear Lola, whether you could apply that curious power you have over savage animals to the taming of the more brutal of humans." "I wonder," she said thoughtfully. "I should like to see you seize a drunken costermonger in the act of jumping on his wife by the scruff of the neck and reduce him to such pulp that he sat up on his tail and begged." "Oh, Simon," she exclaimed reproachfully, "I quite thought you were serious." "So I am, my dear," I returned quickly. "As serious as I can be." She laughed. "Do you remember the first day you came to see me? You said that I could train any human bear to dance to whatever tune I pleased. I wonder if the same thought was at the back of your head." "It wasn't. It was a bad and villainous thought. I came under the impression that you were a dangerous seductress." "And I'm not?" Oh, that spring day, that delicious tingle in the air, that laughing impertinence of the budding trees in the park through which we were then driving, that enveloping sense of fragrance and the nearness and the dearness of her. Oh, that overcharge of vitality. I leaned my head to hers so that my lips nearly touched her ear. My voice shook. "You're a seductress and a witch and a sorcerer and an enchantress." The blood rose to her dark face. She half closed her eyes. "What else am I?" she murmured. But alas, I had not time to answer, for the brougham stopped at the gates of the Zoological Gardens. We both awakened from our foolishness. My hand was on the door-handle when she checked me. "What's the good of a mind if you can't change it? I don't feel in a mood for wild beasts today, and I know you don't care to see me fooling about with them. I would much rather sit quiet and talk to you." With a woman who wants to sacrifice herself, there is no disputing. Besides, I had no desire to dispute. I acquiesced. We agreed to continue our drive. "We'll go round by Hampstead Heath," she said to the chauffeur. As soon as we were in motion again, she drew ever so little nearer and said in her lowest, richest tones, and with a coquetry that was bewildering on account of its frankness, "What were we talking of before we pulled up?" "I don't know what we were talking of," I said, "but we seem to have trodden on the fringe of a fairy tale." "Can't we thread on it again?" She laughed happily. "You have only to cast the spell of your witchery over me again." She drew yet a little nearer and whispered, "I'm trying to do it as hard as I can." An adorable softness came into her eyes, and her hand instinctively closed round mine in its boneless clasp. The long, pent-up longing of the woman vibrated from her in waves that shook me to my soul. My senses swam. Her face quivered glorious before me in a black world. Her lips were parted. Careless of all the eyes in all the houses in the Avenue Road, St. John's Wood, and in the head of a telegraph boy whom I only noticed afterwards, I kissed her on the lips. All the fullness and strength of life danced through my veins. "I told you I was quite alive," I said with idiotic exultation. She closed her eyes and leaned back. "Why did you do that?" she murmured. "Because I love you," said I. "It has come at last." Where we drove I have no recollection. Presumably an impression of green rolling plain with soft uplands in the distance signified that we passed along Hampstead Heath. The side thoroughfare with villa residences on either side may have been Kilburn High Road. The flourishing, busy, noisy suburb may have been Kilburn. The street leading thence to the Marble Arch may have been Maida Vale. To me, they were paths in dreamland. We spoke but little, and what we did say was in the simple, commonplace language which all men use in the big crises of life. There was no doubt now of my choice. I loved her. Love had come to me at last. That was all I knew at that hour, and all I cared to know. Lola was the first to awake from dreamland. She shivered. I asked whether she felt cold. "No, I can't believe that you love me. I can't. I can't." I smiled in a masterful way. "I can soon show you that I do." She shook her head. "I'm afraid, Simon. I'm afraid." "What of?" "Myself." "Why?" "I can't tell you. I can't explain. I don't know how to. I've been wrong, horribly wrong. I'm ashamed." She gripped her hands together and looked down at them. I bent forward so as to see her face, which was full of pain. "But, dearest of all women," I cried, "what in the world have you to be ashamed of?" She paused, moistened her lips with her tongue, and then broke out. "I'll tell you. A decent lady like your Eleanor Faversham wouldn't tell. But I can't keep these things in. Didn't you begin by saying I was a seductress? No, let me talk. Didn't you say I could make a man do what I wanted? Well, I wanted you to kiss me. And now you've done it, you think you love me, but you don't. You can't." "You're talking the wickedest nonsense that ever proceeded out of the lips of a loving woman," I said aghast. "I repeat in the most solemn way that I love you with all my heart." "In common decency you couldn't say otherwise." Again I saw the futility of disputation. I put my hand on hers. "Time will show, dear. At any rate, we have had our hour of fairyland." "I wish we hadn't," she said. "Don't you see it was only my sorcery, as you call it, that took us there? I meant us to go." At last we reached Cadogan Gardens. I descended and handed her out, and we entered the hall of the mansions. The porter stood with the lift door open. "I'm coming up to knock all this foolishness out of your head." "No, don't, please, for heaven's sake," she whispered imploringly. "I must be alone to think it all out. It's only because I love you so. And don't come to see me for a day or two. Say 2 days. This is Wednesday. Come on Friday. You think it over as well, and if it's really true, I'll know then when you come. Goodbye, dear. Make Gray drive you where to go." She wrung my hand, turned, and entered the lift. The gate swung to, and she mounted out of sight. I went slowly back to the brougham and gave the chauffeur the address of my eyrie. He touched his hat. I got in and we drove off. And then for the first time it struck me that an about-to-be shabby gentleman with a beggarly 200 a year ought not, in spite of his quarterings, to be contemplating marriage with a wealthy woman who kept an electric brougham. The thought hit me like a stone in the midriff. What on earth was to be done? My pride rose up like the deus ex machina in the melodrama and forbade the banns. To live on Lola's money, the idea was intolerable. Equally intolerable was the idea of earning an income by means against the honesty of which my soul clamoured aloud. "Good God!" I cried. "Is life, now I've got to it, nothing but an infinite series of dilemmas? No sooner am I off one than I'm on another. No sooner do I find that Lola, and not Eleanor Faversham as the woman sent down by heaven to be my mate, than I realise the same old dilemma. Lola on one horn, and Eleanor replaced on the other by pride and honour and all sorts of capital-letter considerations. Life is the very deuce," said I, with a wry appreciation of the subtlety of language. Why did Lola say, "You're Eleanor Faversham"? I had enough to think over for the rest of the evening, but I slept peacefully. Light loves had come and gone in the days past, but now for the first time love that was not light had come into my life. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. "The Lord will find a way out of the dilemma," said I confidently to myself as I neared Cadogan Gardens 2 days after the revelatory drive. Lola is in love with me, and I am in love with Lola, and there is nothing to keep us apart but my pride over a matter of a few halfpence. I felt peculiarly jaunty. I just posted to Finch the last of the articles I had agreed to write for his reactionary review, and only a couple of articles for another journal remained to be written in order to complete my literary engagements. Soon I should be out of the house of bondage in which I had been a slave, at first willingly and now rebelliously, from my cradle. The great wide world with its infinite opportunities for development received my liberated spirit. I had broken the shackles of caste. I had thrown off the perfumed garments of Epicureanism, the vesture of my servitude. My emotions, once stifled in the enervating atmosphere, now awake fresh and strong in the free air. I was elemental. The man wanted the woman, and I was happy because I knew I was going to get her. Such must be the state of being of a dragonfly on a sunny day. And, shall I confess it, I had obeyed the dragonfly's instinct and attired myself in the most resplendent raiment in my wardrobe. My morning coat was still irreproachable, my patent leather boots still gleamed, and, having had some business in Piccadilly, I stepped into my hatter's and emerged with my silk hat newly ironed. I positively strutted along the pavement. For 2 days I had not seen her, or heard from her, or written to her. I had scrupulously respected her wishes, foolish though they were. Now I was on my way to convince her that my love was not a moment's surge of the blood on a spring afternoon. I would take her into my arms at once, after the way of men, and she, after the way of women, would yield adorably. I had no doubt of it. I tasted in anticipation the bliss of that first embrace, as if I had never kissed a woman in my life. And indeed, what woman had I kissed with the passion that now ran through my veins? In that embrace all the ghosts of the past women would be laid for ever, and a big and lusty future would make glorious beginning. By heaven, I cried, almost articulately. With the splendour of the world at my command, why should I not write plays, novels, poems, rhapsodies, so as to tell the blind, groping, loveless people what it is like? "Take me up to Lola Brandt," said I to the lift porter. "Madame Brandt is not in town, sir," said the man. I looked at him open-mouthed. "Not in town?" "I think she's gone abroad, sir. She left with a lot of luggage yesterday, and her maid, and now the flat is shut up." "Impossible!" I cried aghast. The porter smiled. "I can only tell you what has happened, sir." "Where has she gone to?" "I couldn't say, sir." "Her letters? Has she left no address to which they are to be forwarded?" "Not with me, sir." "Did she say when she was coming back?" "No, sir, but she dismissed her cook with a month's wages, so it seems as though she was gone for a good spell." "Well, what time yesterday did she leave?" "After lunch. The cabman was to drive her to Victoria, London, Cheltenham, Dover Railway." "That looks like the 2:20 to Paris," said I. But the lift porter knew nothing of this. He had given me all the information in his power. I thanked him and went out into the sunshine, a blinking, dazed, bewildered, and piteously crushed man. She had gone, without drum or trumpet, maid and baggage and all, having dismissed her cook and shut up the flat. It was incredible. I wandered aimlessly about Chelsea, trying to make up my mind what to do. Should I go to Paris and bring her back by main force? But how did I know that she had gone to Paris? And if she was there, how could I discover her address? Suddenly an idea struck me. She would not have left Quast and the Cattery in the same unceremonious fashion to get on as best they might. She would have given Quast money and directions. At any rate, he would know more than the lift porter of the mansions. I decided to go to him forthwith. By means of trains and omnibuses, I arrived at the house in a little street off Rosebery Avenue, Clerkenwell, where the maker of gymnastic appliances had his being. I knocked at the door. A grubby man appeared. I inquired for Quast. Quast had left that morning in a van, taking his cages of cats with him. He had gone abroad and was never coming back again, not if he knew it, said the grubby man. The cats were poison, and Quast was a low-down foreigner, and it would have cost him a year's rent to put the place in order again. Whereupon he slammed the door in my face and left me disconsolate on the doorstep. The only other person with whom I knew Lola to be on friendly terms was Sir Joshua Oldfield. I entered the first public telephone office I came to and rang him up. He had not seen Lola for a week, and had heard nothing from her relating to her sudden departure. I went sadly home to my birdcage in Victoria Street, feeling that now at last the abomination of desolation had overspread my life. Why had she gone? What was the meaning of it? Why not a line of explanation? And the simultaneous disappearance of Quast and the cats, what did that betoken? Had she been summoned, for any reason, to the Maison de Saint, where Anastasius Papadopoulos was incarcerated? If so, why this secrecy? Why should Lola, of all people, side with destiny and make a greater tomfool of me than ever? This could be no other than the final jest. I do not care to remember what I did and said in the privacy of my little room. There are things a man locks away even from himself. I was in the midst of my misery when the bell of my tiny flat rang. I opened the door and found my sister Agatha smiling on the threshold. "Hello," said I, gazing at her stupidly. "You're not effusive in your welcome, my dear Simon," she remarked. "Won't you ask me to come in?" "By all means," said I. "Come in." She entered and looked round my little sitting room. What a pillbox in the sky! I had no idea it was as tiny as this. I think I shall call you St. Simon Stylites. I was in no mood for Agatha. I bowed ironically and inquired as to what I owed the honour of the visit. "I want you to do me a favour, a great favour. I'm dying to see the new dances at the Palace Theatre. They say they dance on everything except their feet. I've got a box. Tom promised to take me, now he finds he can't. I've telephoned all over the place for something uncompromising, in or out of trousers, to accompany me, and I can't get hold of anybody. So I've come to you." "I'm vastly flattered," said I. She dismissed my sarcasm with bird-like impatience. "Don't be silly. If I had thought you would like it, I should have come to you first. I don't want to bore you, but I did think you would pull me out of a hole." "What's a hole?" I asked. "I've paid for a box and I can't go by myself. How can I? Do take me, there's a dear." "I'm afraid I'm too dull for haunts of merriment," said I. She regarded me reproachfully. "It isn't often I ask you to put yourself out for me. The last time was when I asked you to be the baby's godfather. And a pretty godfather you've been. I bet you don't remember the name." "I do," said I. "What's it, then?" It's... I snapped my fingers. The brat's name had for the moment gone out of my distracted head. She broke into a laugh and ran her arm through mine. "Dorcas." "Yes, of course, Dorcas. I was going to say so." "Then you were going to say it wrong, for it's Dorothy. Now you must come, for the sake of penance." "I'll do anything you please," I cried in desperation, "so long as you'll not talk to me of my own affairs and will let me sit as glum as ever I choose." Then for the first time she manifested some interest in my mood. She put her head to one side and scanned my face narrowly. "What's the matter, Simon?" "I've absorbed too much life the last few days," said I, "and now I've got indigestion." "I'm sorry, dear old boy, whatever it is," she said affectionately. "Come round and dine at 7:30, and I promise not to worry you." What could I do? I accepted. The alternative of procuring Agatha an evening's amusement was pacing up and down my bird-cage and beating my wings, figuratively, and perhaps my head, literally, against the bars. "It's awfully sweet of you," said Agatha. "Now I'll rush home and dress." I accompanied her down the lift to the front door and attended her to her carriage. "I'll do you a good turn some day, dear," she said as she drove off. I rather flatter myself that Agatha had no reason to complain of my dullness at dinner. In my converse with her I was faced by various alternatives. I might lay bare my heart, tell her of my love for Lola and my bewildered despair at her desertion. This I knew she would no more understand than if I had proclaimed a mad passion for a young lady who waited on me at a tea-shop, or for a cassowary at the zoo. Even the best and most affectionate of sisters have their sympathetic limitations. I might have maintained a mysterious and Byronic gloom. This would have been sheer bad manners. I might have attributed my lack of spontaneous gaiety to toothache or stomachache. This would have aroused sisterly and matronly sympathies, and I should have had the devil's own job to escape from the house unpoisoned by the nostrums that lurk in the medicine chest of every well-conducted family. Agatha, I knew, had a peculiarly burlesque equipment. Lastly, there was the worldly device, which I adopted, of dissimulating the furnace of my affliction beneath a smiling exterior. Agatha therefore found me an entertaining guest and drove me to the Palace Theatre in high good humour. There, however, I could resign my role of entertainer in favour of the professionals on the stage. I sat back in my corner of the box and gave myself up to my harassing concerns. Young ladies warbled, comic acrobats squirted siphons at each other and kicked each other in the stomach. Jugglers threw plates and brass balls with dizzying skill. The famous dancers gyrated pyrotechnically. The house applauded with delight. Agatha laughed and chuckled and clapped her hands, and I remained silent, unnoticed and unnoticing in my reflective corner, longing for the foolery to end. Where was Lola? Why had she forsaken me? What remedy in the fiend's name was there for this heart-torture within me? The most excruciating agonies of the little pain inside were child's play to this. I bit my lips so as not to groan aloud, and contorted my features into the semblance of a smile. During a momentary interview there came a knock at the box door. I said, "Come in." The door opened, and there, to my utter amazement, stood Dale Kinnersley. Dale, sleek, alert, smiling, attired in the very latest nicety of evening dress affected by contemporary youth. Dale, such as I knew and loved but 6 months ago. He came forward to Agatha, who was little less astounded than myself. "How do you do, Lady Darrell? I'm in the stalls with Harry Essendale. I tried to catch your eye, but couldn't, so I thought I'd come up." He turned to me with frank, outstretched hand. "How do, Simon?" I grasped his hand and murmured something unintelligible. The thing was so extraordinary, so unexpected, that my wits went wandering. Dale carried off the situation lightly. It was he who was the man of the world, and I the unresourceful stumbler. "He's looking ripping, isn't he, Lady Darrell? I met old Oldfield the other day, and he was raving about your case. The thing has never been done before. Says they're going mad over your chap in Paris. They're giving him medals and wreaths and decorations till he goes about like a prize bull at a fair. By Jove, it's good to see you again." "You might have taken an earlier opportunity," Agatha remarked with some acidity. "So I might," retorted Dale blandly. "But when a man's a born ass, it takes him some time to cultivate sense. I've been wanting to see you for a long time, Simon, and tonight I just couldn't resist it. You don't want to kick me out?" "Heaven forbid," said I somewhat brokenly, for the welcome sight of his face and the sound of his voice aroused emotions which even now I do not care to analyse. "It was generous of you to come up." He coloured. "Rot," said he, in his breezy way. "Hello, the curtain's going up. What's the next item? Oh, those fool dogs." "I adore performing dogs," said Agatha, looking towards the stage. He turned to me. "Do you?" The last thing on earth I desired to behold at that moment was a performing animal. My sensitiveness led me to suspect a quizzical look in Dale's eye. Fortunately, he did not wait for my answer, but went on in a boyish attempt to appease Agatha. "I don't despise them, you know, Lady Durrell, but I've seen them twice before. They're really rather good. There's a football match at the end, which is quite exciting." "Oh, the beauties!" cried Agatha Overder, as the dogs trotted on the stage. I nodded an acknowledgment of the remark, and she plunged into rapt contemplation of the act. Dale and I stood at the back of the box. Suddenly he whispered, "Come out into the corridor. I've something to say to you." "Certainly," said I, and followed him out of the box. He thrust his hands into his pockets and looked at me with a defiant and you-be-damned air of the young Briton who was about to commit a gracious action. I knew what he was going to say. I could tell by his manner. I dreaded it, and yet I loved him for it. "Why say anything, my dear boy?" I asked. "You want to be friends with me again. God knows I want to be friends again with you. Why talk?" "I've got to get it off my chest," said he, in his so familiar vernacular. "I want to tell you that I've been every end of a silly ass, and I want you to forgive me." I vow I've never felt so miserably guilty towards any human being as I did at that moment. I've never felt such a smug-faced hypocrite. It was a humiliating position. I had inflicted on him a most grievous wrong, and here he was, pleading for forgiveness. I could not pronounce the words of pardon. He misinterpreted my silence. "I know I've behaved rottenly to you since you've been back, but the first step's always so difficult. You mustn't bear a grudge against me." "My dear boy," I cried, my hand on his shoulder, touched to the heart by his simple generosity, "don't let us talk of grudges and forgiveness. All I want to know is whether you're contented." "Contented?" he cried. "I should just think I am. I'm the happiest ass that doesn't eat thistles." "Explain yourself, my dear Dale," said I, relapsing into my old manner. "I'm going to marry Maisie Edison." I took him by the arm and dragged him inside the box. "Agatha," said I, "leave those confounded dogs for a moment and attend to serious matters. This young man has not come up to see either of us, but to obtain our congratulations. He's going to marry Maisie Ellerton." "Tell me all about it," said Agatha, intensely interested. A load of responsibility rolled off my shoulders like Christian's pack. I looked at the dog football match with the interest of a Sheffield puddler at a cup tie, and clapped my hands. An hour or so later, after we had seen Agatha home, and Dale had incidentally chucked Lord Essendale, the phrase is his own, we were sitting over whisky and soda and cigars in my Victoria Street flat. The ingenuousness of youth had insisted on this prolongation of our meeting. He had 1,000 things to tell me. They chiefly consisted in a reiteration of the statement that he had been a rampant and unimagined silly ass, and that Maisie, who knew the whole lunatic story, was a brick, and 1,000,000 times too good for him. When he entered my humble lodging, he looked round in a bewildered manner. "Why on earth are you living in this mousetrap?" "Agatha calls it a pillbox, and I call it a bird-cage. I live here, my dear boy, because it is the utmost I can afford." "Rot! I've been your private secretary and know what your income is." I sighed heavily. I should have to get a leaflet printed setting out the causes that led to my change of fortune. Then I could hand it to such of my friends as manifest surprise. Indeed, I'd grown so used to the story of my lamentable pursuit of the Umurius that I rattled it off mechanically after the manner of the sturdy beggar telling his mendacious tale of undeserved misfortune. To Dale, however, it was fresh. He listened to it open-eyed. When I had concluded, he brought his hand down on the arm of the chair. "By Jove, you're splendid! I always said you were. Just splendid!" He gulped down half a tumbler of whisky and soda to hide his feelings. "And you've been doing all this while I've been making a howling fool of myself? Look here, Simon, you were right all along the line from the very first when you tackled me down Lola. Do you remember?" "Why refer to it?" I asked. "I must," he burst in quickly. "I've been longing to put myself square with you. By the way, where is Lola?" "I don't know," said I with grim truthfulness. "Don't know? Has she vanished?" "Yes," said I. "That's the end of it, I suppose. Poor Lola. She was an awfully good sort, you know," said Dale. "And I won't deny I was hit. That's when I came such a cropper. But I realise now how right you were. I was just caught by the senses, nothing else. And when she wrote to say it was all off between us, my vanity suffered damnably, old chap. I lost the election through it. Didn't attend to business. That brought me to my senses. Then Essendale took me away yachting, and I had a quiet time to think, and after that I somehow took to seeing more of Maisie. You know how things happen, and I'm jolly grateful to you, old chap. You saved me from God knows what complications. After all, good sort as Lola is, it's rot for a man to go outside his own class, isn't it?" "It depends upon the man, and also the woman," said I, beginning to derive peculiar torture from the conversation. Dale shook his wise head. "It never comes off," said he. After a pause he laughed aloud. "Don't you remember the lecture you gave me? My word, you did talk. You produced a string of ghastly instances where the experiment had failed. Let me see, who was there? Paget, Merridew, Bullen. No, I'm well out of it, old chap, thanks to you." "If any good has come of this sorry business," said I gravely, "I'm only too grateful for Providence." He caught the seriousness of my tone. I didn't want to touch on that side of it," he said awkwardly. "I know what an infernal time you've had. It must have been Gehenna. I realise now that it was on my account, and so I can never do enough to show my gratitude." He finished his glass of whisky and walked about the tiny room. "What has always licked me," he said at length, "is why she never told me she was married. It's so curious, for she was as straight as they make 'em. It's devilish odd." "Yes," I assented wearily, for every word of this talk was a new pain. "Devilish odd." "I suppose it's a question of class again." "Or sex," said I. "What has sex to do with being straight?" "Everything," said I. "Rot," said Dale. I sighed. "I wish your dialectical vocabulary were not so limited." He laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. "Still the same old Simon. It does my heart good to hear you. May I have another whisky?" I took advantage of this break to change the conversation. He had told me nothing of his own affairs, save that he was engaged to Maisie Ellerton. "Heavens!" cried he, "isn't that enough?" "An engagement isn't an occupation." "Isn't it, by Jove?" He laughed boyishly. "I managed, however, to squeeze in a bit of work now and then. The mater has always got plenty on hand for me, and I do things for Raggles. He's been awfully decent. The first time I met him, or any of the chiefs, after the election, I was in a blue funk. But no one seemed to blame me. They all said they were sorry. And now Raggles is looking out for a constituency for me to nurse for the next general election. Then things will hum, I promise you." He waved his cigar with the air of a young paladin about to conquer the world. In spite of my own depression, I could not help smiling with gladness at the sight of him. With his extravagantly cut waistcoat, his elaborately exquisite white tie, his perfectly fitted evening clothes, with his supple ease of body, his charming manner, the preposterous fellow made as gallant a show as any ruffling blade in powder and red-heeled shoes. He had acquired, too, an extra touch of manhood since I'd seen him last. I felt proud of him, conscious that to the making of him I had to some small degree contributed. "You must come out and lunch with Maisie and me one day this week," said he. "She would love to see you." "Wait till you're married," said I, "and then we'll consider it. At present Maisie is under the social dominion of her parents." "Well, what of it?" "Just that," said I. Then the truth dawned on him, who grew excited and said it was damnable. He wasn't going to stand by and see people believe a lot of scandalous lies about me. He had no idea people would give me the cold shoulder. He would jolly well, such were his words, take a something, I forget the adjective, megaphone, and trumpet about society what a splendid fellow I was. I'll tell everybody the whole silly-ass story about myself from beginning to end, he declared. I checked him. You're very generous, my dear boy, said I, but you'll do me a favour by letting folks believe what they like. And then I explained, as delicately as I could, how his sudden championship could be of little advantage to me, and might do him considerable harm. In his impetuous manner he cut short my carefully expressed argument. Rubbish! Heaps of people I know are already convinced that I was keeping Lola Brandt, and that you took her from me in the ordinary vulgar way. Yes, I interrupted, shrinking. That's why I order you, in God's name, to leave the whole thing alone. But confound it, man, I've come out of it all right. Why shouldn't you? Even supposing Lola was a loose woman. I threw up my hand. Stop! He looked disconcerted for a moment. We know she isn't, but for the argument. Don't argue, said I. Let us drop it. But hang it all, he shouted in desperation. Can't I do something? Can't I go and kick somebody? I lost my self-control. I rose and put both my hands on his shoulders and looked him in the eyes. You can kick anybody you please whom you hear breathe a word against the honour and purity of Madame Lola Brandt. Then I walked away, knowing I had betrayed myself, and tried to light a cigar with fingers that shook. There was a pause. Dale stood with his back to the fireplace, one foot on the fender. The cigar took some lighting. The pause grew irksome. My regard for Madame Brandt, said I at last, is such that I don't wish to discuss her with anyone. I looked at Dale and met his keen eyes fixed on me. The faintest shadow of a smile played about his mouth. Very well, said he dryly, we won't discuss her. But all the same, my dear Simon, I can't help being interested in her. And as you're obviously the same, it seems rather curious that you don't know where she is. Do you doubt me? I asked, somewhat staggered by his tone. Good heavens, no. But if she has disappeared, I'm convinced that something has happened which I know nothing of. Of course, it's none of my business. There was a new and startling note of assurance in his voice. Suddenly he had developed during the past few months. What I had done, heaven only knows. Misfortune, which is supposed to be formative of character, seemed to have turned mine into pie. How can I otherwise account for my not checking the lunatic impulse that prompted my next words? Well, something has happened, said I, and if we were to be friends, you'd better know it. 2 days ago, for the first time, I told Madame Brandt that I loved her. This very afternoon I went to get her answer to my question, would she marry me? And I found that she'd disappeared without leaving any address behind her. So whenever you hear her name mentioned, you can just tell everybody that she's the one woman in the whole wide world I want to marry. Poor old Simon, said Dale. Poor old chap. That's exactly how things stand. Lord, who would have thought it? How I've borne with you talking about her all this evening, the devil only knows, I cried. You've driven me half crazy. You should have told me to shut up. I did. Poor old Simon. I'm so sorry, but I had no idea you had fallen in love with her. Fallen in love? Said I, losing my head. She's the only woman on God's earth I've ever cared for. I want her as I've wanted nothing in the universe before. And you've come to care for her as much as that? He said sympathetically. Poor old Simon. Why the devil shouldn't I shouted, nettled by his poor old Simons. Lola Brandt is hardly of your class, said Dale. I broke out furiously. Damn class, I've had enough of it. I'm going to take my life into my own hands and do what I like with it. I'm going to choose my mate without any reference to society. I've cut myself adrift from society. It can go hang. Lola Brandt is a woman worth any man's loving. She is a woman in a million. You know nothing whatever about her. The last words were scarcely out of my mouth when an echo from the distance came, and as it were banged my ears. Dale himself had shrieked them at me in exactly the same tone with reference to the same woman. I stopped short and looked at him for a moment, rather stupidly. Then the imp of humour, who for some time had deserted me, flew to my side and tickled my brain. I broke into a chuckle, somewhat hysterical, I must admit, and then, throwing myself into an armchair, gave way to uncontrollable laughter. The scare of the unexpected rose in Dale's eyes. "Why, what on earth is the matter?" "Can't you see?" I cried, as far as paroxysms of my mirth would let me. "Can't you see how exquisitely ludicrous the whole thing has been from beginning to end? Don't you realise that you and I are playing the same scene as we played months ago in my library, with every difference that we have changed roles? I'm the raving, infatuated youth, and you're the grave and reverent mentor. Don't you see? Don't you see?" "I can't see anything to laugh at," said Dale sturdily. And he couldn't. There are thousands of bright, flame-like human beings constituted like that. Life spreads out before them one of its most side-splitting, topsy-turvy farces, and they see in it nothing to laugh at. To Dale the affair had been as serious and lacking in the fantastic as the measles. He had got over the disease, and I was exceedingly sorry to perceive that I had caught it in my turn. "It isn't funny a bit," he continued. "It's quite natural. I see it all now. You cut me out from the very first. You didn't mean to. You never thought of it. But what chance had I against you? I was a young ass, and you were a brilliant man of the world. I bear you no grudge. You played the game in that way. Then things happened, and at last you've fallen in love with her, and now just at the critical moment she's gone off into space. Must be devilish painful for you, if you ask me." "Oh, Dale," said I, shaking my head, "the only fitting end to the farce would be if you wandered over Europe to find and bring her back to me." "I don't know about that," said he, "because I am engaged, and that, as I said, gives me occupation. But if I can do anything practicable, my dear old Simon, you've only got to send for me." He pulled out his watch. "My hat," he exclaimed, "it's past 2 o'clock." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. I am a personage apart from humanity. I vary from the kindly ways of man. A curse is on me. Surely no man has fought harder than I have done to convince myself of the deadly seriousness of existence. And surely before the feet of no man has destiny cast such stumbling blocks to faith. I might be an ancient dweller in the Thebaid, struggling towards dreams of celestial habitations, and confronted only by grotesque visions of hell. No matter what I do, I'm baffled. I look upon sorrow and say, "Lo, this is tragedy." And hey presto, a trick of lightning turns it into farce. I cry aloud in perfervid zeal, "Life is real, life is earnest, and the apotheosis of the fantastic is not its goal." And immediately a grinning irony comes to give the lie to my credo. Or is it that by inscrutable decree of the almighty powers I am undergoing punishment for an old unregenerate point of view, being doomed to wear my detested motley for all eternity, to stretch out my hand forever to grasp realities, and find I can do naught but beat the air with my bladder, to listen with strained ear perpetually expectant of the music of the spheres, and catch nothing but the mocking jingle of the bells on my fool's cap? I don't know. I give it up. Such were my thoughts on the morning after my interview with Dale, when I had read a long, long letter from Lola, which she had dispatched from Paris. The letter lies before me now, many pages in a curious, half-formed foreign hand. Many would think it an ill-written letter, for there are faults of spelling and faults of grammar. But even now, as I look on those faults, the tears come into my eyes. Oh, how exquisitely, pathetically, monumentally, sublimely foolish! She had little or nothing to do with it, poor dear. It was only the arch Jester again, leading her blindly away, so as once more to leave me high and dry on my hill of derision. "My dear, you must forgive me. My heart is breaking, but I know I'm doing right. There's nothing for it but to go out of your life for ever. It terrifies me to think of it, but it's the only way. I know you think you love me, dear, but you can't. You can't really love a woman so far beneath you. And I would sooner never see you again than marry you and wake up one day and find that you hated and scorned me." Can you wonder that I shook my fist at heaven and danced with rage? Miss Eleanor Faversham called on me just a few minutes after you left me that afternoon. We had a long talk. Simon, dear, you must marry her. You loved her once, for you were engaged, and only broke it off because you thought you were going to die. And she loves you, Simon, and she is a lady with all the refinement and education that I could never have. She is of your class, dear, and understands you and can help you on, whereas I could only drag you down. I am not fit to black her boots. And so forth, in the most heart-rending strain of insensate self-sacrifice and heroic self-abasement. The vainest and most heartless dog of a man stands abashed and helpless before such things in a woman. She had not seen or written to me because she would not have her resolution weakened. After the great wrench, succeeding things were easier. She had taken Anastasius's cats and proposed to work them in the music halls abroad, and send the proceeds to be administered for the little man's comfort in the Maison de Saint. As both her name and the Papadopoulos troupe of cats were well known in the variety world, it would be a simple matter to obtain engagements. She had already opened negotiations for a short season somewhere abroad. I was not to be anxious about her. She would have plenty of occupation. I am not sending you any address, for I don't want you to know where I am, dear. I shan't write to you again unless I scribble things and tear them up without posting. This is final. When a woman makes such a break, she must do it once and for all. Oh, Simon, when you kissed me 2 days ago, you thought you loved me. But I know what the senses are and how they deceive people, and I had only just caught your senses on that spring afternoon, and I made you do it. For I had been aching for months for a word of love from you. And when it came, I was ashamed. But I should have been weak and shut my eyes to everything, if Miss Faversham had not come to me like God's good angel. At the fourth reading of the letter I stopped short at these words. God's good angel, indeed. Could anything have been more calculated to put a man into a frenzy? I seized my hat and stick and went in search of the nearest public telephone office. In less than 10 minutes I had arranged an immediate interview with Eleanor Faversham at my sister Agatha's, and in less than half an hour I was pacing up and down Agatha's sitting room waiting for her. God's good angel. The sound of the words made me choke with wrath. There are times when angelic interference in human destinies is entirely unwarrantable. I stamped and I fumed, and I composed a speech in which I told Eleanor exactly what I thought of angels. As I had to wait a considerable time, however, before Eleanor appeared, the raging violence of my wrath abated, and when she did enter the room, smiling and fresh, with the spring in her clear eyes and a flush on her cheek, I just said, "How do you do, Eleanor?" in the most commonplace way, and offered her a chair. "I've come, you see. You were rather peremptory, so I thought it must be a matter of great importance." "It is," said I. "You went to see Madame Brandt." "I did," she replied, looking at me steadily, "and I have tried to write to you, but it is more difficult than I thought." "Well," said I, "it's no use writing now, for you've managed to drive her out of the country." She half rose in her chair and regarded me with wide blue eyes. "I've driven her out of the country?" "Yes, with her maid and her belongings and Anastasius Papadopoulos' troupe of performing cats and Anastasius Papadopoulos' late pupil and assistant Quarst. She's given up her home in London and now proposes to be a wanderer among the music halls of Europe." "But that's not my fault. Indeed it isn't." "She says in a letter I received this morning, bearing no address, that if you hadn't come to her like God's good angel, she would have remained in London." Eleanor looked bewildered. "I thought I had made it perfectly clear to her." "Made what clear?" She blushed a furious red. "Can't you guess? You must be as stupid as she is. And of course you're wildly angry with me, aren't you?" "I certainly wish you hadn't gone to see her." "Was it merely to tell me this that you ordered me to come here?" she asked, with a touch of anger in her voice, for however much like God's good angels young women may be, they generally have a spirit of their own. I felt I had been wanting in tact, also that I put myself, through an impetuosity foreign to what I had thought to be my character, in a foolish position. If I replied affirmatively to her question, she would have served me perfectly right by tossing her head in the air and marching indignantly out of the room. I temporised. "In order to understand the extraordinary consequences of your interview, I should like to have some idea of what took place." "I know, my dear Eleanor, I continued as gently as I could. "I know that you went to see her out of the very great kindness of your heart." "No, I didn't." I made a little gesture in lieu of reply. There was a span of silence. Eleanor played with the silky ears of Agatha's little Yorkshire terrier, which had somehow strayed into the room and taken possession of her lap. "Don't you see, Simon?" she said at last, half tearfully, without taking her eyes off the dog. "Don't you see that by accusing me in this way you make it almost impossible for me to speak? And I was going to be so loyal to you." A tear fell down her cheek onto the dog's back and convicted me of unmitigated brutality. "What else could you be but loyal?" I murmured. "Your attitude all through has shone it." She flashed her hand angrily over her eyes and looked at me. "And I wanted to be loyal to the end. If you had waited and she had waited, you would have seen. As soon as I could have conveyed it to you decently, I should have shown you—" She broke off, put the Yorkshire Terrier on the sofa beside her, and rose with an impatient gesture. "You want to know why I called on Lola Brandt? I felt I had to know for myself what kind of woman she was. She was the woman between us, you and me. You don't suppose I ceased to care for you just because what we thought was a fatal illness broke off our engagement? I did care for you. I cared for you, in a way. I say, in a way, I'll tell you why later on. When we met here the last time, do you think I was not moved? I knew your altered position would not allow you to suggest a renewal of the engagement, so I offered you the opportunity. Do you remember? But I could not tell whether you still cared for me or whether you cared for the other woman. So I had to go and see her. I couldn't bear to think that you might feel in honour bound to take me at my word and be caring all the time for someone else. I went to see her, and then I realised that I didn't count. Don't ask why. Women know these things. And I found that she loved you with a warmth and richness I'm incapable of. I felt I'd stepped into something big and splendid, as if I'd been a caterpillar walking into the heart of a red rose. I felt prim and small and petty. Until then, I'd never known what love meant, and I didn't feel it. I couldn't feel it. I couldn't give you a millionth part of what that woman does. And I knew that, having lived in that atmosphere, you couldn't possibly be content with me. If you'd waited, I should have found some means of telling you so. That's what I meant by saying I was loyal to you. And I thought I had made it clear to her. Seems I didn't. It isn't my fault. "My dear," said I, when she had come to the end of this astonishing avowal, and stood looking at me somewhat defiantly and twisting her fingers nervously in front of her, "I don't know what in the world to say to you." "You can tell me at least that my instinct was right." "Which one? A woman has so many." "That you love Lola Brandt." I lifted my arms in a helpless gesture and let them drop to my sides. "One is not one's own master in these things." "Then you do?" "Yes," said I in a low voice. Eleanor drew a long breath, turned and sat again on the sofa. "And she knows it?" "I have told her so." "Then why in the world has she run away?" "Because you two wonderful and divinely foolish people have been too big for each other. While you were impressed by one quality in her, she was equally impressed by another in you. She departed, burning her ships, so as to go entirely out of my life, for the simple reason, as she herself expresses it, that she was not fit to black your boots." "So," said I, taking her left hand in mine and patting it gently, "between you two dear, divine angel fools, I fall to the ground." A while later, just before we parted, she said in her frank way, "I know many people would say I've behaved with shocking impropriety, immodestly and all that. You don't, do you? I believe half the unhappiness in life comes from people being afraid to go straight at things. Perhaps I've gone too straight this time. But you'll forgive me?" I smiled and squeezed her hand. "My dear," said I, "Lola Brandt was right. You are God's good angel." I went away in a chastened mood, no longer wrathful, for what could woman do more for mortal man than what Eleanor Faversham had attempted? She had gone to see whether she should stand against her rival, and with a superb generosity, unprecedented in her sex, she had withdrawn. The magnanimity of it overwhelmed me. I walked along the street exalting her to viewless pinnacles of high-heartedness. And then suddenly the devil whispered in my ear that execrated word, humorati. It poisoned the rest of the day. It confirmed my conviction of the ironical designs of destiny. Destiny, not content with making a victim of the accursed principle in my own person, had used these two dear women as its instruments in dealing me fresh humiliation. Where would it end? Where could I turn to escape such an enemy? If I had been alone in Green Fields instead of Sloane Square, I should have clapped my hands to my head and prayed God not to drive me crazy. I should have cried wild vows to the winds and shaken my fist at the sky and rolled upon the grass and made a genteel idiot of myself. Nature would have understood. Men do these things in time of stress, and I was in great stress. I loved a woman for the first time in my life, and I was a man nearly 40. I wanted her with every quivering nerve in me, and she was gone, lost in the vast expanse of Europe with a parcel of performing cats, gone out of my life, loving me as I loved her, all on account of this hell-invented principle. Ye gods! If the fierce, pure, deep, abiding love of a man for a woman is not a reality, what in this world of shadows is anything but vapour? I grasped it tight, hugged it to my bosom, and now she was gone, and in my ears rang the derisive laughter of the enemy. Where would it end? What would happen next? Nothing was too outrageously and maniacally impossible. I walked up Sloane Street, a street for which impeccable respectability, security of life and person, comfortable, modern, 20th century, prosperous smugness, has no superior in all the smug cities of the earth, and I was prepared to encounter with a smile of recognition anything that the whirling brains of Bedlam had ever conceived. Why should not this little lady, tripping along with gold chain bag and anxious shopping knit of the brow, throw her arms round my neck and salute me as her long-lost brother? Why should not the patient horses in that omnibus suddenly turn into griffins and begin to snort fire from their nostrils? Why should not that policeman, who on his beat was approaching me with a heavy, measured tread, suddenly arrest me for complicity in the Patzer conspiracy or the Rye House plot? Why should not the whole of the decorous street suddenly change into the inconsequence of an Empire ballet? Why should not the heavens fall down and universal chaos envelop all? The only possible reason I can think of now is that the almighty powers did not consider it worth while to go to quite so much trouble on my account. This, however, gives you some idea of my state of mind. But though it lasted for a considerable time, I would not have you believe that I fostered it unduly. Indeed, I repudiated it with some disgust. I took it out, examined it, and, finding it preposterous, set to work to modify it into harmony with the circumstances of my everyday life. Even the most sorely tried of men cannot walk abroad, shedding his exasperation around like pestilence. If he does, he's put in a lunatic asylum. If a man cannot immediately assuage the hunger of his heart, he must meet starvation with a smiling face. In the meantime, he has to eat so as to satisfy the hunger of his body, to clothe himself with a certain discrimination, to attend to polite commerce with his fellow man, and to put to some fair use the hours of his day. I did not doubt but that by means of intelligent inquiry, which I determined to pursue in every possible direction, I should sooner or later obtain news of Lola. A lady with a troop of performing cats could not for long remain in obscurity. True, I might have gone in gallant quest of her, but I had had enough of such fool adventures. I bided my time, consulted with Dale, who took up the work of a private detective agency with his usual zeal, writing letters to every crony who languished in the exile of foreign embassies, and corresponding, unknown to Lady Kinnersley, with the agencies of the International Aid Society. Did what I could on my own account, and turned my attention seriously to the regeneration of the Judds. As the affairs of one drunken tailor's family could not afford me complete occupation for my leisure hours, I began to find myself insensibly drawn by Campion's unreflecting enthusiasm into all kinds of small duties connected with Barbara's building. Before I could realise that I had consented, I discovered myself in charge of an evening class of villainous-looking and uncleanly youths who assembled in one of the lecture rooms to listen to my recollections of the history of England. I was to continue the course begun by a young Oxford man, who, for some reason or other, had migrated from Barbara's building to Toynbee Hall. "I've never done any schoolmastering in my life. Suppose," said I, with vivid recollections of my school days, "suppose they rag me?" "They won't," said Cameron, who had come to introduce me to the class. And they did not. I found these 25 youthful members of the proletariat the most attentive, respectable and intelligent audience that ever listened to a lecture. Gradually I came to perceive that they were not as villainous-looking and uncleanly as at first sight I had imagined. A great many of them took notes. When I came to the end of my dissertation on Henry VIII, I went among them, as I discovered this custom to be, and chatted, answering questions, explaining difficulties, and advising as to a course of reading. The atmosphere of trust and friendliness compensated for the lack of material sweetness. Here were young men pathetically eager to learn, grateful for every crumb of information that came from my lips. They reminded me of nothing more than the ragged class of scholars around a teacher in a medieval university. Some had vague dreams of eventually presenting themselves for examinations: the Science and Art Department, the College of Preceptors, the matriculation of the University of London. Others longed for education for its own sake, or rather as a means of raising themselves in the social scale. Others, bitten by the crude socialism of their class, had been persuaded to learn something of past movements of mankind, so to obtain some basis for their opinions. All were in deadly earnest. The magnetic attraction between teacher and taught established itself. After 1 or 2 lectures, I looked forward to the next with excited interest. Other things Campion offhandedly put into my charge. I went on tours of inspection round the houses of his competing housewives. I acted as his deputy at the police court when ladies and gentlemen with a good record of Barbara's got into trouble with the constabulary. I investigated cases for the charity of the institution. In quite a short time I realised with a gasp that I had become part of the machinery of Barbara's building, and was remorselessly and helplessly whirled hither and thither with the rest of the force of the driving wheel, which was Rex Campion. The amazing, the astounding, the utterly incredible thing about the whole matter was that I not only liked it, but plunged into it heart and soul as I'd never plunged into work before. I discovered sympathies that had hitherto lain undreamed of within me. In my electioneering days I had, it is true, foregathered with the sons of toil. I had shaken the horny hands of men and the soap-suddy hands of women. I flattered them and cajoled them and shown myself mighty affable, as a sensible and aspiring parliamentary candidate should do. But the way to their hearts I had never found. I had never dreamed of seeking. And now it seemed as if the great gift had been bestowed on me, and I examined it with a new and almost tremulous delight. Also, for the first time in all my life, I had taken pain to be the companion of my soul. All my efforts to find Lola were fruitless. I became acquainted with the heartache, the longing for the unattainable, the agony of spirit. The only anodyne was a forgetfulness of self, the only compensation, a glimmer of a hope and the shadow of a smile in the grey and leaden lives around me. On Whit Monday evening I was walking along the Thames Embankment on my way home from Waterloo Station, wet through, tired out, disappointed, and looking forward to the dry, soft raiment, the warm, cosy room, the excellent dinner that awaited me in my flat. I, with several others, had been helping Campion with his annual outing of factory girls and young hooligans. The weather, which had been perfect on Saturday, Sunday, and when we had started, a gay and astonishing army, at 7 o'clock, had broken before 10. It had rained, dully miserable, insistently, all day long. The happy day in the New Forest had been a damp and dismal fiasco. I was returning home thinking I might walk off an incipient chill, as depressed as no one but the baffled philanthropist can be, when I perceived a tattered and dejected man sitting on a bench, a clothes basket between his feet, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands and sobbing as if his heart would break. As the spectacle of a grown-up man crying bitterly in a public thoroughfare was somewhat remarkable, I paused, and then in order to see whether his distress was genuine, and also not to arouse his suspicions, I threw myself in an exhausted manner on the bench beside him. He continued to sob. At last I said, raising my voice, "You seem to be pretty miserable. What's wrong?" He turned bleared yet honest-looking eyes upon me. "The old blasted show," said he. "There's nothing right in it, swelp me God." I gave a modified assent to the proposition and drew my coat collar over my eyes. "Being wet through doesn't make it any better," said I. "Who would have thought it would come down as it has today? Tell me that. It's enough to make a man cut his throat." I was somewhat surprised. "You're not in such a great distress just because it has been a rainy day." "Ain't I just?" he exclaimed. "It's been and gone and ruined me, this day has. Look here, Governor, I'll tell you all about it. I've been out at work, see. I was in hospital for 3 months and I couldn't get nothing regular to do when I come out. I'm a packer by trade. I did odd jobs, see, and the wife, she earned a little too, and we managed to keep things going and to scrape together 5 shillings. That's 3 months' sailing against Whitsun Bank holiday. And as the weather was so fine, I laid it all out in paper windmills to sell to the kids on Hampstead Heath. And I started out this morning with a basket full of them, all so fine and pretty. And no sooner did I get on the heath than the rain comes down and wipes out the old blooming lot before I could sell one. Look here." He drew a bedraggled sheet of newspaper from the clothes basket and displayed a piteous, sodden welter of sticks and gaudy pulp. At the sight of it he broke down again and sobbed like a child. "And there's not a bite in the house, nor there likely to be for days, and I daren't go home and face the missus and the kids. I wish I was dead." I had already seen many pitiful tragedies during my brief experience with Campion, but the peculiar pitifulness of this one wrung my heart. It taught me, as nothing had done before, how desperately humble are the aspirations of the poor. I thought of the cosy comfort that awaited me in my own home, the despair that awaited him in his. I put my hand in my pocket. "You seem to be a good chap," said I. He shrugged his shoulders. The consciousness of applauded virtue offered no consolation. I drew out a couple of half-crowns and threw them into the basket. "For the missus and the kids," said I. He picked them out of the welter and, holding them in his hand, looked at me stupidly. "Can you afford it, Governor?" At first I thought this remark was some kind of ill-conditioned sarcasm, but suddenly I realised that, dripping wet and covered with mud from head to foot, with a shapeless old green Homburg hat drooping forlornly about my ears, I did not fulfil his conception of the benevolent millionaire. I laughed and rose from the bench. "Yes, quite well. Better luck next time." I nodded a good-bye and walked away. After a minute he came running after me. "Here," said he, "I ain't thanked you. God knows how I'm going to do it. I can't, but here. Would you mind if I chucked a lot of the stuff into the river and told the missus I'd sold it and just got back my money? She's proud, she is, and has never accepted a penny in charity in her life. It's only because I would be better for her." He looked at me with such earnest appeal that I saw that the saving of his wife's pride was a serious matter. "Of course," said I, "and here's a few halfpence to add to it, so as to give colour to the story." He saw that I understood. "Thank you kindly, sir," said he. "Tell me," said I, "do you love your wife?" He gaped at me for a moment. Obviously the question had never been put to him either by himself or anybody else. Then, seeing that my interest was genuine, he spat and scratched his head. "We've been together 20 years, he said, in a low voice, emotion struggling with self-consciousness. "And I've had nothing agin her all that time. She's a blooming wonder, I'll tell you straight." I held out my hand. "At any rate, you've got what I haven't," said I. "A woman who loves you to welcome you home." And I went away longing for Lola's arms and the deep love in her voice. Now that I come to view my actions in some sort of perspective, it seems to me that it was the underlying poignancy of this trumpery incident, a poignancy which nevertheless bit deep into my soul, that finally determined the current of my life. A short while afterwards, Campion, who for some time past had found the organisation of Barbara's building had far outgrown his individual power of control, came to me with a proposal that I should undertake the management of the institution under his general directorship. As he knew of my financial affairs and of my praiseworthy but futile efforts to live on £200 a year, he offered me another £200 by way of salary and quarters in the building. I accepted, moved to the salvage of my belongings from Victoria Street to Lambeth, and settled down to the work for which a mirth-loving Providence had destined me from my cradle. When I told Agatha, she nearly fainted. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. No sooner had I moved into Barbara's building and was preparing to begin my salaried duties than I received news sent me off post-haste to Berlin. And just as it was not I, but Anastasius Papadopoulos who discovered Captain Vauvenard, so in this case it was Dale who discovered Lola. He burst in upon me one day, flourishing a large visiting card which he flung down on the table before my eyes. "Do you recognise that?" It was the familiar professional card of the unhappy Anastasius. "Yes." "Do you see the last line?" I read, "London agents, Messrs. Conter and Blagg, 172 Maiden Lane, W.C." I looked up. "Well?" I asked. "It has done the trick," said he triumphantly. "What fools we were not to have thought of it before. I was rooting out a drawer of papers and came across the card. You remember he handed us one all round the first day we met him. I put it away. I'm rather a methodical devil with papers, as you know. When I found it, I danced a hornpipe all round the room and went straight off to Conter and Blagg. I made certain she would work through them as though they were accustomed to shop the cats, and I found I was right. They knew all about her. Wouldn't give her address, but told me that she was appearing this week at the Winter Garden at Berlin. Why that pudding-headed quagga Bevan of the embassy hasn't kept his eyes open for me as he promised," he went on a while later, "I don't know. I can understand Eugene Patternhausen, the owl-eyed coot who runs the International Aid Society, not doing a hand's turn to aid anybody, but Bevan? For heaven's sake, while you're there, call at the embassy and kick him." "You forget, my dear boy," said I with a laugh, for his news had made me light-hearted. "You forget that I have entered upon a life of self-denial, and one of the luxuries I must deny myself is that of kicking attachés. I've a good mind to go with you and do it myself, but it'll keep. Do you know, it's rather quaint, isn't it?" he said, after a pause, as if struck by a luminous idea. "It's rather quaint that it should be I who am playing the little tin god on wheels for you two and saying, 'Bless you, my children.'" I thought the humour of the situation couldn't fail to strike you at last. "Yes," said he, knitting his brows into an air of dark reflection. "It is funny, devilish funny." I dismissed him with grateful words, and in a flurry of excitement went in search of Campion, whom I was lucky to find in the building. "I'm sorry to ask for leave of absence," said I, "before I've actually taken up my appointment, but I must do so. I am summoned at once to Berlin on important business." Campion gave willing consent. "How long will you be away?" "That depends," said I, with a smile which I meant to be enigmatic, but assuredly must have been fatuous, "upon my powers of persuasion. I have bright thoughts of going to Berlin and back in a meteoric flash, bringing Lola with me on my return journey, to marry her out of hand as soon as we reach London. Cats and winter gardens concern me but little, and of trifles like contracts I took no account." "If you're there any time," said Campion, tugging thoughtfully at his black beard, "you might look into what the Germans are doing with regard to female rescue work. You might pick up a practical tip or two for use down here." What a thing it is to be a man of one idea! I gave him an evasive answer and rushed away to make the necessary preparations for my journey. I was absurdly, boyishly happy. No doubt as to my success crossed my mind. It was to be my final triumphant adventure. Unless the high powers stove a hole in the steamer or sent another railway train to collide with mine, the non-attainment of my object seemed impossible. I had but to go, to be seen, to conquer. I arrived safely in Berlin at 7:30 in the evening, and drove to a modest hotel in the Kaiserstrasse, where I had engaged a room. My first inquiry was for a letter from Lola. To my disappointment, nothing awaited me. I had telegraphed to her at the Wintergarten the day before, and I had written as well. A horrible surmise began to dance before me. Suppose Messrs. Conto and Black had given Dale erroneous information? I grew sick and faint at the thought. What laughter there would be at Olympus over my fool journey! In great agitation I clamoured for a programme of the Wintergarten entertainment. The hotel clerk put it in my trembling hands. There was no mention of Madame Lola Brandt, but to my unspeakable comfort I saw the announcement, Professorin Anastasius Papadopoulos und hier wunderbaren Katzen. Lola was working the cats under the little man's name. That was why she had baffled the inquiries instituted by Dale and myself, and had not received my telegram. I scribbled a hasty note in which I told her of my arrival, my love, and my impatience, that I proposed to witness the performance that evening, and to meet her immediately afterwards at the stage door. This, addressed to the Professorian Anastasius Papadopoulos, I dispatched by special messenger to the Wintergarten. After a hasty toilet and a more hurried meal, I went out, and, too impatient to walk, I hailed a droshky and drove through the wide, cheery streets of Berlin. It was a balmy June evening. The pavements were thronged. Through the vast open fronts of the cafes one saw agglutinated masses of people, just cleft here and there by white-jacketed waiters darting to and fro with high-poised trays of beer and coffee. Save and the folks in theatres, all Berlin was in the streets, taking the air. A sense of gaiety pervaded the place, organised and recognised, as though it were as much part of a Berliner's duty to himself, the fatherland and the Almighty, to be gay when the labours of the day are over, as to be serious during business hours. He goes through it with a grave face and enjoys himself prodigiously. Your Latin, when he fills the streets with jest and laughter, obeys the ebullience of his temperament. Your Teuton always seems to be conscientiously obeying a book of regulations. I soon arrived at the Wintergarten and secured a stall near the stage. The vast building was packed with a smoking and perspiring multitude. In shape it was like a long tunnel or a long, narrow railway station, an impression intensified by a monotonous barrel roof. This was, however, painted blue and decorated with myriads of golden stars. Along one side ran a gallery, where those who liked to watch the performance and eat a 6-course dinner at the same time could do so in elaborate comfort. In the centre of the opposite side was the stage, and below it, grouped in a semicircle, the orchestra. Beneath the starry roof hung long wisps of smoke clouds. The performance had only just begun, and Lola's turn was 7th on the list. I reflected that greater deliberation in my movements would have suited the maturity of my years, besides enabling to eat a more digestible dinner. I had come with the unreasoning impatience of a boy, fully conscious that I was too early, yet desperately anxious not to be too late. I laughed at myself indulgently and patted the boy in me on the head. Meanwhile, I gave myself up with mild interest to the entertainment provided. It was the same as that at any music hall, Wintergarten, or variety theatre the world over. The same brawny gentlemen in tights made human pyramids out of themselves, and played football with the little boys, and minced with their aggravating steps down to the footlights. The same red-nosed clown tried to emulate his dashing companion on the horizontal bars, pulling himself up, to the eternal delight of the audience, by the seat of his baggy breeches, and hanging his hat on the smooth steel upright. The same massive lady with the deep chest sang sentimental ballads. The same Chinaman produced warrens of rabbits and flocks of pigeons from impossible receptacles. The same half-dozen scantily clad damsels sang the same inane chorus in the same flat baby voices and danced the same old dance. Mankind in the bulk is very young. It is very easily amused, and, like a child, clamours for the oft-repeated tale. The curtain went down on the last turn before Lola's. I felt a curious suspense, and half wished that I had not come to see the performance. I shrank from finding her a million miles away from me, a new, remote creature, impersonal as those who had already appeared on the stage. Mingled with this was a fear lest she might not please this vast audience. Failure, I felt, would be as humiliating to me as to her. Agatha, I remembered, confessed to the same feeling with regard to myself when I made my first speech in the House of Commons. But then I had an incontrovertible array of facts and arguments drawn up by an infallible secretary and welded into cunning verbiage by myself, which I learned off by heart. And the House, as I knew it would, had been half asleep. I couldn't fail. But Lola had to please 3,000 wide-awake Berlin citizens who paid their money for entertainment, with no other equipment than her own personality and the tricks of a set of wretched, irresponsible cats. The orchestra struck up the act music. The curtains parted and revealed the brightly polished miniature gymnasium I'd seen at Anastasius's cattery. The row of pussies at the back, each on a velvet stand, some white, some tabby, some long-furred, some short-furred, all sitting with their forepaws doubled demurely under their chests, wagging their tails comically, and blinking with feline indifference at the footlights. A cage in a corner in which I described the ferocious wild tomcat, and, busily putting the last touches to the guy ropes, the pupil and assistant Quast, neatly attired in a close-fitting bottle green uniform with brass buttons. Almost immediately, Lola appeared, in a shimmering gold evening gown and with a necklet of barbaric gold around her neck. I had never seen her so magnificently, so commandingly beautiful. I was conscious of a ripple of admiration running through the huge assembly, and it was a queer sensation, half pride, half angry jealousy. My immediate neighbours were emphatic in their praise. Applause greeted her. She smiled acknowledgments, and, flicking the little toy whip which she carried in her hand, she began the act. First of all, the cats jumped from their stands, right-turned like a military line, and walked in procession round the stage. At a halt and a signal, each pussy put its front paws on its front neighbour, and the march began again. Then Lola did something with voice and whip, and each cat dropped on its paws, and as by magic there appeared a space between every animal. At a further word, the last chap jumped over the one in front, and over the one in front of that, and so on, until, having cleared the first cat, it leaped on to its stand, where it began to lick itself placidly. Meanwhile, the penultimate cat had begun the same evolution, and then the antepenultimate cat, until all the cats had cleared the front one and had taken their positions on their stands. The last cat, left alone, looked round, yawned in the face of the audience, and, turning tail, regained its stand with the air of unutterable boredom. The audience, delighted, applauded vehemently. I raised my hands as I clapped them, trying vainly and foolishly to catch Lola's eye. At a clap of her whip, a white Angora and a sleek tabby jumped from the stands and took up their positions one at each end of a miniature tightrope. Lola stuck a tiny Japanese umbrella in the collar of each and sent them forth on their perilous journey. When they met in the middle, they spat and caterwauled and argued spitefully. The audience shrieked. Then, by a miracle, the cats cleared each other and pursued their sedate and cautious ways to their respective ends of the rope. The next act was a team of a dozen rats drawing a tiled chariot driven by a stolid coal-black cat with green, expressionless eyes, down an aisle formed by the other cats, who sat in solemn contemplation on their tails. There was no doubt of Lola's success. The tricks were as marvellous in themselves as their execution was flawless. During the applause, I noticed her eagerly scanning the sea of faces. Her eyes seemed to be turned in my direction. I waved my handkerchief. An instinct told me that at last she recognised the point of pink and the flutter of white as me. Then the stage was cleared of the gentle cats, and the wire cage containing Hephaestus was pushed forward by Quast. He showed off the ferocious beast's quality by making it dash itself against the wires, arch its huge back, and shoot out venomous claws. Lola commanded him by sight to open the cage. He approached in simulated terror, Hephaestus uttering blood-curdling howls, and every time he touched the handle of the door, Hephaestus sprang at him like a tiger with the tomcat's hateful hiss. At last, amid the laughter of the audience, for this was pre-arranged business, Quast suddenly refused to obey his mistress any more, and went and sat on the floor in the corner of the stage. Then Lola, with a glance of contempt at him for his poltroonery and a glance of confidence at the audience, opened the cage door and dragged the gigantic and malevolent brute out by the scruff of its neck and held it up like a rabbit, as she had done in Anastasia's cattery. Suddenly her iron grip seemed to relax. She made one or two ineffectual efforts to retain it, and the brute dropped to the ground. She looked at it for a second, disconcerted, as if she had lost her nerve, and then in a horrible flash the beast sprang at her face. She uttered piercing screams. The blood spurted from the ghastly claws. Quick as lightning, Quast leapt forward and dragged it off. Lola clapped both hands to her eyes and reeled and tottered to the wings, where I saw a man's 2 arms receive her. The last thing I saw was Quast kneeling on the beast on the floor, mastering him by some professional clutch. Then there rang out a sharp whistle, and the curtain went down with a run. I rose, sick with horror, barely conscious of the gasping excitement that prevailed around me, and blindly groped my path through the crowded rows of folk towards the door. I had only proceeded halfway when a sudden silence made me turn, and I saw a man addressing the audience from the stage. Apparently it was the manager. He regretted to have to inform the audience that Madame Papadopoulos would not be able to conclude her most interesting performance that evening, as she had unfortunately received injuries of a very grave nature. Then he signalled to the orchestra, who crashed into a loud and vulgar march with clanging brass and thundering drum. It sounded so cynically and hideously inhuman that I trampled recklessly over people in my mad rush to the exit. I found the stage door, where a knot of the performers were assembled, talking of the horrible accident. I pushed my way shiveringly through them and tried to rush into the building, but was checked by a burly porter. I explained incoherently in my rusty German. I came for news of Madame Papadopoulos. I was her Vorlopter, I declared, with a gush of inspiration. Whether he believed that I was her affianced, I know not, but he made me wait and disappeared with my card. I became at once the object of the curiosity of the loungers. I heard them whispering together as they pointed me out and pitying me. "The cat had torn her face away," said one woman. I put my hands over my ears so as not to hear. Presently the porter returned with a stout person in authority, who drew me into the stage doorkeeper's box. "You are a friend of Frau Papadopoulos?" "Friend," I cried, "she is to be my wife. I am in a state of horror and despair. Tell me what has happened." Seeing my condition, he laid aside his official manner and became human. "It was a dreadful accident," said he. "The beast had apparently got its claws in near her eyes, but what were her exact injuries he could not tell, as her face was all over blood and she had fainted with the pain. The doctor was with her. He had telephoned for an ambulance. I was to be quite certain that she would receive every possible attention. He would give my card to the doctor. Meanwhile, I was quite at liberty to remain in the box till the ambulance came." I thanked him. "In the meantime," said I, "if you can let me have a word with Fraulein Dawkins, her maid, should she be in the theatre, or Quast, her attendant, I should be very grateful." He promised and withdrew. The doorkeeper gave me a wooden chair, and there I sat for an unconscionable time, faint and dizzy with suspense. The chance words I had heard in the crowd, the manager's remark about the claws, the memory of the savage spring of the beloved face made me feel sick. Every now and then, as some doors leading to the stage swung open, I could hear the orchestra and the laughter and applause of the audience. Both Dawkins and Quast visited me. The former was in a helpless state of tears and hand-wringing. As she knew no word of German, she could understand nothing that the doctors or others said. Madame was unconscious. Her head was tightly bandaged. That was all the definite information she had. "Did Madame know I was in front tonight?" I asked. "Oh, yes, sir. I think she had a letter from you. She was so pleased, poor dear Madame. She told me that you would see the best performance she had ever given." Whereupon she broke down and was useless for further examination. Then Quast came. He could not understand how the accident had occurred. Hephaestus had never before tried to attack her. She had absolute mastery over him, and he usually behaved with her as gently as any of the other cats. With himself it was quite different. He was accustomed to Hephaestus springing at him, but then he beat him hard with a great stick until he was so sore that he could neither stand up nor lie down. "I've always implored Madame to carry something heavier than that silly little whip, and now it's all over. She'll never be able to control him again. If Isis will have to be killed and I will be desolate. Ha! What a misfortune!" He began to weep. "Good God," I cried, "you don't mean to say that you're sorry for the brute?" "Well, can't help being fond of him. We've been for 5 years inseparable companions." I had no sympathy to fling away on him at that moment. How do you account for his spring at Madame tonight? That's all I want to know." "She must have been thinking of something else when she grabbed him, for she missed her grip. Then he fell and was frightened, and she must have lost her nerve. Hephaestus knew it and sprang. That is always the case when wild animals turn. All accidents happen like that." His words filled me with a new and sickening dread. She must have been thinking of something else. Of what else but of my presence there? That stupid, selfish wave of the handkerchief. I sat gnawing my hands and cursing myself. The ambulance arrived. Men hurried past my box. I waited again in agony of mind. At last the porter came and cleared the passage and doorway of loungers, and I heard the tread of footsteps and gruff directions. The manager and a man in a frock coat and black tie, whom I recognised as the doctor, came down the passage, followed by 2 great men carrying between them a stretcher, covered by a sheet, on which lay all that I loved in life. Dawkins followed weeping, and then came several theatre folk. I went outside and saw the stretcher put into the ambulance van, and then I made myself known to the doctor. "She has received very great injuries, chiefly the right cheek and eye. So much so that she needs an oculist's care at once. I have telephoned to Dr. Steinholtz of number 4 Tiergarten, one of our ablest oculists, to receive her now into his clinic. If you care to do so, you are welcome to accompany me." I drove through the gay, flaring streets of Berlin like a man in a phantasmagoria of horror. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. The first time they allowed me to see her was after many days of nerve-wracking anxiety. I had indeed called at the clinique 2 or 3 times a day for news, and I had written short letters of comfort and received weirdly spelt messages taken down from Lola's dictation by a nurse with an imperfect knowledge of English. These kept the heart in me, for the doctor's reports were invariably grave. Possible loss of sight in the injured eye and permanent disfigurement, their most hopeful prognostications. I lived, too, in a nervous agony of remorse. For whatever happened, I held myself responsible. At first they thought her life was in danger. I passed nightmare days. Then the alarming symptoms subsided, and it was a question of the saving of the eye and the decent healing of the cheek torn deep by the claws of the accursed brute. When Quast informed me of its summary execution, I felt the primitive savage rise in me, and I upbraided Quast for not having invited me to gloat over its expiring throes. How the days passed, I know not. I wandered about the streets, looking into the windows of the great shops, buying flowers and fruit for Lola in eccentric quantities. Or sitting in beer-houses reading the financial pages of a German paper held upside down. I could not return to London. Still less could I investigate the German philanthropic methods of rescuing fallen women. I wrote to Campion a brief account of what had happened, and besought him to set a deputy to work on the regeneration of the Judds. At last they brought me to where Lola lay, in a darkened room, with her head tightly bandaged. A dark mass spread over the pillow, which I knew was her glorious hair. I could scarcely see the unbandaged half of her face. She still suffered acute pain, and I was warned that my visit could only be of brief duration, and that nothing but the simplest matters could be discussed. I sat down on a chair by the left side of the bed. Her wonderful nervous hand clung round mine as we talked. The first thing she said to me in a weak voice, like the faint echo of her deep tones, was, "I am going to lose all my good looks, Simon, and you won't care to look at me any more." She said it so simply, so tenderly, without a hint of reproach in it, that I almost shouted out my horrible remorse. but I remembered my injunctions and refrained. I strove to comfort her, telling her mythical tales of surgical reassurances. She shook her head sadly. "It was like you to stay in Berlin, Simon," she said after a while. "Although they wouldn't let me see you, yet I knew you were within call. You can't conceive what a comfort it has been." "How could I leave you, dear?" said I, with the thought of you throbbing in my head night and day. "How did you find me?" "Through Conto and Blagg. I tried all other means, you may be sure, but now I've found you, I shan't let you go again." This was not the time for elaborate explanations. She asked for none. When one is very ill, one takes the most unlikely happenings as commonplace occurrences. It seemed enough to her that I was by her side. We talked of her nurses, who were kind, of the skill of Dr. Steinholz, who brought into his clinique the rigid discipline of a man of war. "He wouldn't even let me have your flowers," she said, "and even if he had, I shouldn't have been able to see them in this dark hole." She questioned me as to my doings. I told her of my move to Barbara's buildings. "And I'm keeping you from all that splendid work," she said weakly. "You must go back at once, Simon. I shall get along nicely now, and I shall be happy now that I've seen you again." I kissed her fingers. "You have to learn a lesson, my dear, which will do you an enormous amount of good." "What is that?" "The glorious duty of selfishness." Then the minute hand of the clock marked the end of the interview, and the nurse appeared on the click and turned me out. After that I saw her daily. Gradually our interviews lengthened, and as she recovered strength, our talks wandered from the little incidents and interests of the sick-room to the general topics of our lives. I told her of all that had happened to me since her flight, and I told her that I wanted her, and only her, of all women. "Why, oh, why did you do such a foolish thing?" I asked. "I did it for your good." "My dear, have you ever heard the story of the tender-hearted elephant? No? It was told in a wonderful book published years ago and called The Fables of George Washington Aesop. This is it. There was once an elephant who accidentally trod on the mother of a brood of newly hatched chickens. Her tender heart filled with remorse for what she had done, and overflowing with pity for the fluffy orphans, she wept bitterly, and addressed them thus: "Poor little motherless things, doomed to face the rough world without a parent's care, I myself will be a mother to you." Whereupon, gathering them under her with maternal fondness, she sat down on the whole brood. The unbandaged half of her face lit up with a wan smile. "Did I do that? I didn't conceive it possible that you could love me except for the outside things." "You might have waited and seen," said I in mild reproof. She sighed. "You'll never understand. Do you remember my saying once that you remind me of an English duke?" "Yes." "You made fun of me, but you must have known what I meant. You see, Simon, you didn't seem to care a hang for me in that way, until quite lately. You were goodness and kindness itself, and I felt that you would stick by me as a friend through thick and thin. But I'd given up hope for anything else. And I knew there was someone only waiting for you, a real refined lady. So when you kissed me, I didn't dare believe it. And I had made you kiss me. I told you so, and I was as ashamed as if I had suddenly turned into a loose woman. And when Miss Faversham came, I knew it would be best for you to marry her. For all the flattering things she said to me, I knew—" "My dear," I interrupted, "you didn't know at all. I loved you ever since I saw you first lying like a wonderful panther in your chair at Cadogan Gardens. You wove yourself into all my thoughts and around all my actions. One of these days I'll show you a kind of diary I used to keep, and you'll see how I abused you behind your back." Her face, all the dear half of it that was visible, fell. "Oh, why?" "For making me turn aside from the nice little smooth path to the grave which I had marked out for myself. I regarded myself as a genteel semi-corpse and didn't want to be disturbed." "And I disturbed you?" "Until I danced with fury and called down on your dear head maledictions which for foolishness and snap would have made a medieval pope squirm with envy." She pressed my hand. "You are making fun again. I thought you were serious." "I am. I'm telling you exactly what happened. Then, when I was rapidly approaching the other world, it didn't matter. At last I died and came to life again, but it took me a long time to come really to life. I was like a tree in spring which has one bud which obstinately refuses to burst into blossom. At last it did burst, and all the love that had been working in my heart came to my lips, and incidentally, my dear, to yours. This was at the early stages of her recovery, when one could only speak of gentle things. She told me of her simple odyssey, a period of waiting in Paris, an engagement at Vienna and Budapest, and then Berlin. Her agents had booked a week in Dresden and a fortnight in Hamburg, and she would have to pay the forfeit for breach of contract. "I'm sorry for Anastasius's sake," she said. "The poor little mite wrote me rapturous letters when he heard I was out with the cats. He gave me a long special message for each, which I was to whisper in its ear." Poor little Anastasius Papadopoulos. She showed me his letters, written in a great, round, flourishing, sanguine hand. He seemed to be happy enough for the maison de Saint. He had formed, he said, a school for the cats of the establishment, for which the authorities were very grateful, and he heralded the completion of his gigantic combinations with regards to the discovery of the assassination of the horse Sultan. Lola and I never spoke of him without pain, for in spite of his crazy and bombastic oddities, he had qualities that were lovable. "And now," said Lola, "I must tell him that Hephaestus has been killed, and the rest are again idling under the care of the faithful Quast. It seemed a pity to kill the poor beast." "I wish to heaven," said I, "that he had been strangled at birth." "You never liked him." She smiled wanly. "But he is scarcely to be blamed. I grew unaccountably nervous and lost control. All savage animals are like that." And seeing that I was about to protest vehemently, she smiled again. "Remember, I'm a lion tamer's daughter, and brought up from childhood to regard these things as part of the show. There must always come a second's failure of concentration. Lots of tamers meet their deaths sooner or later for the same reason, just a sudden loss of magnetism. The beast gets frightened and springs." Quast had told me exactly what I myself had divined at the sickening moment. I bowed my head and laid the back of her cool hand against it, and groaned out my remorse. If I had not been there, if I had not distracted her attention. She would not listen to my self-reproach. It had nothing to do with me. She had simply missed her grip and lost her head. She forbade me to mention the subject again. The misery of thinking that I held myself to blame was unbearable. I said no more, realizing the acute distress of her generous soul, but in my heart I made a deep vow of reparation. It was, however, with no such chivalrous feelings, but out of the simple longing to fulfil my life, that I asked her definitely, for the first time, to marry me as soon as she could get about the world again. I put before her with what delicacy I could that if she had foolish ideas of my being above her in station, she was above me in worldly fortune, and thus we both had to make some sacrifices to our pride. I said that my work was found, that our lives could be regulated as she wished. She listened without saying a word until I had finished. Then she took my hand. "I'm grateful," she said, "and I'm proud, and I know that I love you beyond all things on earth. But I won't give you an answer till I'm up and about on my feet again." "Why?" I insisted. "Don't ask, and don't mention the matter again. You must be good to me because I'm ill, and do what I say." She smiled and fondled my hand and cajoled a reluctant promise from me. Then came days in which, for no obvious reason, Lola received me with anxious, frightened diffidence, and spoke with constraint. The cheerfulness with which she had hitherto exhibited gave place to dull depression. She urged me continually to leave Berlin, where, she said, I was wasting my time, and return to my work in London. "I shall be all right, Simon, perfectly all right, and as soon as I can travel I'll come straight to London." "I'm not going to let you slip through my fingers again," I would say laughingly. "But I promise you, I swear to you, I'll come back. Only I can't bear to think of you idling around a woman's sick bed when you have such glorious things to do at home. That's a man's work, Simon. This isn't."
But it is a man's work, I would declare, to devote himself to the woman he loves and not to leave her helpless, a stranger in a strange land. I wish she would go, Simon. I do wish she would go, she would say wearily. It's the only favour I've ever asked you in my life. Manlike, I looked within myself to find the reasons for these earnest requests. In casting off my jester's suit, had I also divested myself of the power to be a decently interesting companion? Had I become merely a dull, tactless, egotistical bore? Was I, in simple, naked, horrid fact, getting on an invalid's delicate nerves? I was scared of the new picture of myself thus presented. I became self-conscious and made particular efforts to bring a little gaiety into our talk. But though she smiled with her lips, the cloud, whatever it was, hung heavily on her mind, and at the first opportunity she came back to the ceaseless argument. In despair I took her nurse into my confidence. "She is right," said the nurse. "You are doing her more harm than good. You had better go away and write to her daily from London." "But why? Oh, why?" I clamoured. "Can't you give me any reason?" The nurse glanced at me with a touch of feminine scorn. "The bandages will soon be removed." "Well," said I, "the sight of one eye may be gone." "I know," said I. "She is reconciled to it. She has the courage and resignation of a saint. She has also the very common and natural fears of a woman." "For heaven's sake," I cried, "tell me plainly what you mean." "We don't quite know what disfigurement will result," said the nurse bluntly. "It is certain to be very great, and the dread of your seeing her is making her ill and retarding her recovery. So if you have any regard for her, pack up your things and go away." "But," I remonstrated, "I'm bound to see her sooner or later." The nurse lost patience. "Ach, can't you get into your head that it is essential it should be later, when she is strong enough to stand the strain and has realized the worst and made her little preparations?" I accepted the rebuke meekly. The situation, when explained, was comprehensible to the meanest masculine intelligence. "I will go," said I. When I announced this determination to Lola, she breathed a deep sigh of relief. "I shall be so much happier," she said. Then she raised both her arms and drew my head down until our lips met. "Dear," she whispered, still holding me, "if I hadn't run away from you before, I should run away now. But it would be silly to do it twice. So I'll come to London as soon as the doctor will let me. But if you find you don't and can't possibly love me, I shan't feel hurt with you. I've had some months, I know, of your love, and that will last me all my life, and I know that whatever happens, you'll be my very dear and devoted friend." "I shall be your lover, always," I swore. She shook her head and released me. A great pity welled up in my heart, for I know now why she had forbidden me to speak of marriage, and in some dim way I got to the depth of her woman's nature. I realized, as far as a man can, how the sudden blasting of a woman's beauty must revolutionize not only her own attitude towards the world, but her conception of the world's attitude towards her. Only a few weeks before, she had gone about proudly conscious of her superb magnificence. It was the triumphant weapon in her woman's armoury, to use when she so chose. It had illuminated a man's journey, I knew and felt it now, through the valley of the shadow. It had held his senses captive. It had brought him to her feet. It was a charm that she could always offer to his eyes. It was her glory and her pride to enhance it for his delectation. Her beauty was herself. That gone, she had nothing but a worthless soul to offer. And what woman would dream of offering a man her soul if she had no casket in which to enshrine it? If I had presented this other aspect of the case to Lola, she would have cried out with perfect sincerity, "My soul, you get things like mine anywhere for twopence a dozen." It was the blasting of her beauty that was the infinite matter. All that I loved would be gone. She would have nothing left to give. The splendour of the day had ceased, and now was coming to the long, long, dreary night, to meet with which with dignity she was nerving her brave heart. The tears were not far from her eyes when I said again softly, "Your lover, always, dear." "Make no promises," she said, "except one." "And that is?" "That you will write me often until I come home." "Every day." So we parted, and I returned to London and to my duties at Barbara's building. I wrote daily, and her dictated answers gave me knowledge of her progress. To my immense relief, I heard that the ocular skill had saved her eyesight, but it could not obliterate the traces of the cruel claws. The days, although fuller with work and interests, appeared long until she came. I saw but little of the outside world. Dale, my sister Agatha, Sir Joshua Oldfield, and Campion were the only friends I met. Dale was ingenuously sympathetic when he heard of the calamity. "What's going to happen?" he asked, after he had exhausted his vocabulary of abuse on Cats, Providence, and Anastasius Papadopoulos. "What's the poor dear going to do?" "If I am going to have any voice in the matter," said I, "she's going to marry me." He wrung me by the hand enthusiastically and declared that I was the splendidest fellow that ever lived. Then he sighed. "Are you going about like a sheep without a leader? For heaven's sake, come back into politics. Form a hilarious little party of your own, anything, so long as you're back, and take me with you." "Come to Barbara's building," said I. But he made a wry face and said that he did not think Maisie would like it. I laughed and put my hand on his shoulder. "My son, you have a leader already, and she has already tied a blue riband around your woolly neck, and she is pulling you wherever she wants to go, and it's all to the infinite advantage of your eternal soul." Whereupon he grinned and departed to the sheepfold. At last Lola came. She begged me not to meet her at the station, but to go round after dinner to Cadogan Gardens. Dawkins opened the door for me and showed me into the familiar drawing-room. The long summer day was nearing its end, and only a dim twilight came through the open windows. Lola was standing rigid on the hearthrug, her hand shielding the whole of the right side of her face. With the free hand she checked my impetuous advance. "Stop and look," she said, and then dropped the shielding hand and stood before me with twitching lips and death in her eyes. I saw in a flash the devastation that had been wrought, but thank God I pierced beneath it to the anguish in her heart. The pity, the awful poignant pity of it smote me. Everything that was man in me surged towards her. What she saw in my eyes I know not, but in hers dawned a sudden wonder. There was no recoil of shock such as she had steeled herself to encounter. I sprang forward and clasped her in my arms. Her stiffened frame gradually relaxed, and our lips met, and in that kiss all fears and doubts were dissolved for ever. Some hours later she said, "If you are blind enough to care for a maimed thing like me, I can't help it. I shall never understand it to my dying day," she added with a long sigh. "And you will marry me?" "I suppose I've got to," she replied. And with the old pantherine twist of her body she slid from her easy-chair to the ground and buried her face on my knees. And that is the end of my story. We were quietly married 3 weeks afterwards. Agatha, wishing to humour a maniac for whom she retained an unreasonable affection, came to the wedding and treated Lola as only a sweet lady could. But my doings passed her understanding. As for Jane, my other sister, she cast me from her. People who did these things, she maintained, must bear the consequences. I bore them bravely. It is only now that my name is beginning to be noised abroad as that of one who speaks with some knowledge on certain social questions, that Jane holds out the olive branch of fraternal peace. After a brief honeymoon, Lola insisted on joining me in Barbara's building. A set of rooms next to mine was vacant, and Campion, who welcomed a new worker, had the 2 sets thrown into what house agents term a commodious flat. She is now Lady Superior of the institution. The title is Campion's, and for some odd feminine reason Lola is delighted with it. Yes, this is the end of the story which I began, it seemed in a previous incarnation, at Myrglebed-on-Sea. The maiming of Lola's beauty has been the last jest which the arch-jester has practised on me. I fancy he thought that this final scurvy trick would wipe Simon de Gex for ever out of the ranks of his rivals.
But I flatter myself that, having snapped my fingers in his face, the last laugh has been on my side. He is withdrawn, discomfited from the conflict, and left me master of the ground. Love conquers all, even the arch-jester. There are some who still point to me as one who has deliberately ruined a brilliant career, who pity me as one who has gone under, who speak with shrugged shoulders and uplifted eyebrows at my unfortunate marriage and my obscure and cranky occupation. The world, they say, was at my feet. So it was. But what the pitying critics lack the grace to understand is that better than to have had it under one's feet is to have it, or that of which matters, at one's heart. I sit in this tiny hotel by the sea and reflect that it is over 3 years since I woke from death and assumed a new avatar. And since my marriage, what has been the happenings? Dale has just been elected for the Fensham district of Westmoreland, and he has already begun the line of sturdy young Kinnersleys, of which I had humorous dreams long ago. Quast and the cats have passed into alien hands. Anastasius Papadopoulos is dead. He died 3 months ago of angina pectoris, and Lola was with him at the end. Eleanor Faversham has married a colonial bishop. Campion, too, has married, and married the last woman in the world to whom one would have thought of mating him, a frivolous butterfly of a creature who drags him to dinner parties and Ascot and suppers of the Savoy, and holds Barbara's building and all it connotes in vixenish detestation. He roars out the agony of his philanthropic spirit to Lola and myself, who administer consolation and the cold mutton that he loves. The story of his marriage is a little lunatic drama all to itself, and I will tell it some day. But now I can only rough sketch the facts. He works when he can at the beloved creation of his life and fortune, but the brain that would be inadequate to the self-protecting needs of a ferret controls the action of this masterful enthusiast, and his one awful despair in life is to touch a heart that might beat in the bosom of a vicious and calculating haddock. I only mention this to explain how it has come to pass that Lola and I are now all-powerful in Barbara's building. It has become the child of our adoption, and we love it with a deep and almost fanatic affection. Before Lola, my influence and personality fade into nothingness. She is the power, the terror, the adoration of Lambeth. If she chose, she could control the parliamentary vote of the borough. Her great, direct, large-hearted personality carries all before it, and with it there is something of the uncanny. A feat of hers in the early days is becoming legendary. A woman on the books of the building was about to bring a hopeless human fragment into a grey world. Lola went to see what aid the building could provide. In front of the door lounged the husband, a hulking porter in a Bermondsey factory. Glowering at his feet lay a vicious mongrel dog, bull-terrier, Irish terrier, mastiff. So did Lola with her trained eye distinguish the strains. When she asked for his wife in travail, the chivalrous gentleman took his pipe from his mouth, spat, and after the manner of his kind, referred to the disfigurement of her face in terms impossible to transcribe. She paid no attention. "I'm coming upstairs to see your wife." "If you pass that door, swelp me good, I'll set the dog on you." She paused. He urged the dog, who bristled and growled and showed his teeth. Lola picked the animal up, as she would have picked up a sofa cushion, and threw him across the street. She went to where he had fallen, ordered him to his feet, and the dog licked her hand. She came back with a laugh. "I'll do the same to you if you don't let me in." She pushed the hulking brute aside. He resisted and laid her hands on her. By some extraordinary tamer's art, of which she had in vain tried to explain to me the secret, and with no apparent effort, she glided away from him and sent him cowering and subdued some feet beyond the lintel of the door. The street, which was watching, went into a roar of laughter and applause. Lola mounted the steps and attended to the business in hand. When she came down, the man was still standing at the threshold, smoking an obfuscated pipe. He blinked at her as if she had been a human dynamo. "Come round to Barbara's building at 6 o'clock and tell me how she is." He came on the stroke of 6. The fame of Lola spread through the borough, and now she can walk feared, honoured, unmolested by night or by day through the streets of horror and crime, which neither I nor any other man, no matter how courageous, dare enter at certain hours without the magical protection of a policeman. Sunshine has come at last, both into this little backwater of the world by the sea and into my own life, and it is time I should end this futile record. Yesterday, as we lay on the sands watching the waves idly lap the shore, Lola brought herself nearer to me with a rhythmic movement as no other creature form of woman is capable of, and looked into my eyes. And she whispered something to me which led to an infinite murmuring of foolish things. I put my arms round her and kissed her on the lips and on her cheek, whether the beautiful or the maimed I knew not, and she sank into a long, long silence. At last she said, "What are you thinking of?" I said, "I'm thinking that not a single human being on the face of the earth has a sense of humour." "What do you mean?" she asked. "Simply this," said I, "that what has occurred billions or millions of times on the earth we are now regarding as the only thing that ever happened." "Well," said Lola, "so it is, for us, the only thing that ever happened." And the astounding woman was right. End of chapter 24. End of Simon the Jester by William John Locke.